Okay. Good evening. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden,
Mechanic.
and this is Orthodox Apologetics Live, as always. And so we were actually just in the middle of a discussion because I guess we're talking to Craig Trulia. Hi, Craig. And we are basically discussing the keys of St. Peter. Now, this is an interesting thing, Father, because now what you're saying is, I guess these were keys fashioned, but then how do they come from his body?
I don't know. It has relics of his body in it. I don't know. I don't know enough about it.
Possible. They're possible that the key is a reliquary of the chain and body. Not sure. But in any case, my point is that the concept of physical keys, in the mind of Saint Gregory was very different. Was very different than the modern concept of the keys being something, I guess you could say, far more mystical. From a biblical standpoint, you can see it in terms of the context of binding and loosing, but past that, this whole concept of the keys or the monarchy over the church, which really began in practice with Hildebrand, I don't think we should read that back into St. Gregory. I think he saw the keys very differently. Father?
Yeah, now there are inscriptions, according to the 9th century Liber Pontificalis, over various churches that talk about the keys of St. Peter and such. So, like, over the gates of the Church of St. Peregrinus in Rome, there is an inscription that says, "O God, who didst confirm thy apostle Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and didst grant him the pontificate of binding and loosing, grant that by the help of his intercession we may be delivered from the bonds of our sins, and cause that this city which we have newly founded, with thine assistance, may ever remain safe from thy wrath, and have new and manifold triumphs over the enemy, on whose account it has been constructed, for our Lord Jesus Christ." Although that doesn't really say much, because we acknowledge that St. Peter was given the keys of binding and loosing. The concept is that it wasn't like he was given them and nobody else was.
It's an interesting question. But anyway, today's show, how to make an ecumenical council, it's a question that deals with how councils are accepted in the church, and I'll simplify it like this. It's very simple. Father, you're against ecumenism, correct?
Yeah, of course.
So am I. Therefore, we have a council.
Okay, I don't think we have an ecumenical council yet.
That's not complete, is it? I know.
No.
All right, I've been thinking how to intro this all day, but then the whole keys thing threw me off, so I was going to really do a good job here. Okay, anyway, council by themselves, the nature of the church is conciliar. So we have to start with that to begin with, in the sense that from the very time of the Acts of the Apostles, the church always worked in council. Now, it's interesting because, when we think of ecumenical councils, we generally don't think of the Apostolic Council as an ecumenical council, although technically, if all the apostles were there, it would be representative of the church throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so the first ecumenical council we're dealing with is what? We're talking about the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah, Nicaea would be the first.
All right, and now we should mention that ecumenical councils are called to deal with some sort of heresy. And when we deal with Nicaea, there had already been councils in Alexandria condemning Arianism and in other churches as well. So it's, in this sense, the first ecumenical council is kind of meant to be, I guess, the crowning achievement, I guess, of the deposition of, and it didn't turn out to be because Arianism persisted even after that.
Yeah.
So the bishops assemble, the emperor's there. There is supposed to be, now, do we believe St. Hosius of Cordoba was like a representative? He was a president of the council, wasn't he?
He was president of the council. Was
he actually a representative of the Pope at the time, or what?
He was. Remember that it was the council. They had a council before that. They were the Pope and St. Hosius kind of worked together. I'm trying to remember which council this was. But in any case, it kind of he became the de facto representative of the Pope, even though he wasn't exactly, because he had his own see. He wasn't a legate proper. So he would be in that sense, he would have been assigned legatory powers because I presume the Pope couldn't make it correctly.
All right, so the council is held. the conclusion of the council, we have the first part of the Nicene Creed and the dogmatic decree condemning Arianism. And the bishops accepted. And now I should notice, of the 318 bishops at Nicaea, only 2 bishops dissented. Theognis, I believe, of Libya, and there was one other Arian. And they were basically deposed, removed from their sees. But after the council, the church accepted the council, obviously, but there was still a lot of Arianism kind of made a big resurgence in the 330s and 340s.
Yeah, they had the pseudo.
But of course, they repudiated the Nicaea ultimately.
Right, they were anti-Nicene council.
Yeah, and they've kind of took over the church in the East and repudiated Nicaea, and when the Orthodox or the Nicenes kind of were confined to the margins and into bases mostly the West and to some places in the East.
Yep.
And then we have the Second Ecumenical Council, which was called by the Emperor St. Theodosius, and the Second Ecumenical Council reaffirmed the original condemnation of Arianism, and then it added the condemnation. It reaffirmed the condemnation also of Macedonianism, which is those who deny the divinity of the Holy Ghost. Now, interestingly, at the Second Ecumenical Council, I believe the president was St. Meletius of Antioch.
Yeah.
And if I'm correct, I think he was And now St. Meletius of Antioch, though, was not, however,
recognized by the West.
In fact, that was why I don't believe there were any representatives at the Second Ecumenical Council from Rome that were present. Now, the Rome had already had a council condemning Macedonianism and all this other stuff. So, from their perspective, they were probably thinking, "Oh, this is just for these Eastern people to get together or whatever." But they also did not agree with Meletius being at the council, because the Roman Church and many of the bishops in the West and Italy had agreed that Paulinus was actually the bishop of Antioch, and Paulinus was not invited, or he didn't want to go to the council. So the Second Ecumenical Council ends, and I guess by the 390s, I'm very kind of vague on this. It seems to have, at least by the early 400s, Rome seems to have numbered it as the actual Second Ecumenical Council.
Right, they treated it as an ecumenical council. They accepted its creed, and they disputed the canons.
Well, there was one canon they disputed.
Right, Canon 3.
Yes, and that was the canon that they thought unbalanced the apostolic see concept of the three. Yeah, exactly.
The 3 C's.
Exactly.
For those who don't know, if you look in the writings of St. Leo the Great, the apostolic see is not 1 C, it's 3 C's, and that would be Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, which is why in the Western calendar, all 3, in some way, all 3 C's are venerated. Because,
but this gets to the question of what people call receptionism, and not in the Eucharist, but in the terms of the council. So you have multiple Orthodox churches. They agree they accept, no problem accepting the dogmatic decrees of the council, let's say the Second Ecumenical Council. That's not the issue. But there are certain aspects we might call non-dogmatic or canons of the council that not everyone is quite comfortable with. In the case of Rome, Canon 3? Was it Canon 3, you say?
Yeah, it was Canon 3.
Yeah, so they never really, at that point, I'm not quite sure if, they did not recognize it, all right? But they still accepted all the rest of the Ecumenical Council. And then we have the Third Ecumenical Council condemning, pardon me?
Oh, it is worth noting that despite, the canons have a disciplinary nature to them, but because Antioch and Alexandria were Eastern sees, as much as Rome would have liked to have kept the order as Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, in practice, that didn't actually happen. It was still treated in the same way that the council was noted, and Constantinople was, from then on, listed as second place, despite the process of the popes. Yes.
Of course, the Third Ecumenical Council, that leads to the Nestorianism. The Fourth Ecumenical Council leads to Chalcedon. East Chalcedon leads to the Monophysites breaking away. I'm not sure exactly. Now, I think when we talk about the issue of how the church receives an ecumenical council, it's probably going to be more interesting, I think, to discuss actually the Fifth Ecumenical Council and the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And the reason I say that is because when you're dealing with the first, second, third, fourth, sixth councils, you're dealing with it. And after the council ends, the church basically, everybody accepted it. Okay, there was really no dispute in the church about those councils, because if you're dealing with the sixth ecumenical council, you're ultimately dealing with a council where you're trying to reunite heretics back to the church. I mean, that's kind of what the Sixth Ecumenical Council is about, getting the Monothelites to renounce the heresy. And, Antioch at the Sixth Ecumenical Council doesn't accept the final decision. And so they break away, and then they're later replaced with an Orthodox patriarchate, and then the Maronites kind of form. That's where they kind of come from, before they become papists in the 14th century.
Right.
But when you talk about, let's say, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, you have this strange situation where a lot of bishops in the church don't think it's necessary to hold the Fifth Ecumenical Council. Okay, not just the Roman bishops, but North African bishops. You have some bishops in Egypt and Greece.
Well, the Western bishops felt the Fifth Council was violating Chalcedon.
Yeah, well, they thought it was. Well, remember, Justinian had already held several councils in the 540s that condemned Origenism and condemned all these other things. And so the Fifth Ecumenical Council comes around. Vigilius goes, and all these other some few other representatives of the West go, and everything's all right except when it gets to the issue of what? The three chapters.
Right.
And in particular, it gets to the issue of the letter of the so-called letter of Ibus.
Ibus of Edessa, yeah.
Ibus of Edessa to Maris the Persian. Okay. And what happens is that you have people who would say they have no problem saying God was crucified in the flesh. They will accept everything about the council, but they're like, well, we shouldn't condemn the letter of we shouldn't censure this letter because Chalcedon didn't explicitly censure it. That was the claim. All right, and then it goes to the issue about can you posthumously anathematize people who supposedly died in the peace of the church, and that they're really talking about in that case Theodore of Mopsuestia. All right.
Yeah.
Now I have the Acts of the Council of Fifth Ecumenical Council over here. It's like a 500-page book. I haven't read through all of it, but I should point out that at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, the Emperor Justinian gathered actually records from Mopsuestia, in which the Church of Mopsuestia, by the end of the 5th century, had already removed Theodore's name from the diptychs of the dead, because they kind of discovered stuff he had. Because remember, Theodore technically had supposedly renounced his views about denying Our Lady was Theotokos, but he never really did it. Anyway, so the Fifth Ecumenical Council concludes, and what happens is you have this long drawn-out controversy that happens in parts of like Italy, Greece, and North Africa and France. In Egypt, initially Patriarch Zoilus did not accept it, but he capitulated eventually. There were some protests by some of the other Eastern Patriarchates, but they eventually gave up. They didn't think it was that big of a deal. And what happens is that various North African bishops say that they're willing to accept everything but the council, but they do not believe you can posthumously anathematize Theodore of Mopsuestia, or that there should be a posthumous condemnation of the three chapters and the persons. So most of them don't break communion, except you have a group called the Istrian Schismatics that are on the Dalmatian coast and kind of northeastern Italy in that area. And they do basically get to the point where they condemn everybody else who will not condemn everything about the Fifth Council and break communion with everybody.
Wasn't that also part of the pretext for the schism in Ravenna?
Yeah, well, remember, there was also the Arian Lombards controlled that area. And so the Lombards, even though they were Arians, they felt there was they actually gave political impetus to these people for doing this, because they felt, well, it divided them away from the rest of the Orthodox and the Roman authorities, like by that, the Roman government and such. But I should point out that you still have areas like in North Africa and France and Spain that were still not numbering the Fifth Ecumenical Council as the Fifth Ecumenical Council, even though they accepted the dogmatic decrees, and they accepted it as like kind of a local council, and they just did not agree with certain things like the concept of posthumous condemnation. But they did not break communion with the rest of the church. And this is in fact a discussed issue. That, for example, as far as I understand, Spain only started counting the Fifth Ecumenical Council as what we would consider fifth around the year 700 or so. But they had never condemned the actual dogmatic decrees. All right, and in fact, this was something that in Rome, the various Pope Pelagius II, Saint Gregory the Great, even though they defended the Fifth Ecumenical Council, if people were willing to accept the dogmatic decrees of the council, but they disagreed with some minor point about the three chapters, they were willing to let that slide as long as they didn't make a big deal about it. All right. And so that's kind of an issue of reception. And so you have a case of Rome trying to get everybody to accept the Fifth Council, but they're not really willing to push that far back because people are pushing back. All right. So there's dogmatic agreement, but there are these minor points that not everybody is going in. Well, we might think are minor points that not everybody's going in for. You have anything to say, Father?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we can gather from this process is that it's messy. And it's not just messy in the East, it's messy in the West as well. It's always a messy process. You're always going to have heretics resisting the council. You're going to have people who aren't heretics resisting the council because they have some other reason. In other words, the nature of the council has to fully blossom forth in the Orthodox people.
Yeah, well, and at one point, in the case of the people who weren't heretics resisting it, in the case of North Africa, the problem was that the Emperor Justinian had arrested a lot of North African bishops, or at least the Metropolitan of Carthage and others, and brought them to Constantinople. And some of them died in Constantinople, under house arrest. I mean, they weren't tortured or anything, but that the problem is that if your metropolitan is brought to Constantinople and he's like, I'm not going to sign this, and then he dies under house arrest, that's going to create non-dogmatic reasons for why you're not going to like something happening. If you understand what I mean.
I get what yeah, exactly.
Okay. Go ahead.
But before we go on, FG Apologist wrote, I'm a young Protestant interested in Orthodoxy. Any recommended readings? I say just one or two because you're a beginner. What's your recommendation, Father?
You mean for reading the early church, the Apostolic Fathers?
Yeah, okay. The book, the Apostolic Fathers. Let me get a link to that. I was going to go even simpler. I was going to start with Indication of the Way of the Kingdom of Heaven. But I'm going to put a link to the book for the Apostolic Fathers and a link to the Indication. And that way you have something to read till the next episode. Hold on.
Because the Apostolic Fathers contain St. Clement, St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Polycarp, the people who knew the apostles or were disciples of the disciples of the apostles.
I'm going to go with the earlychurchwritings.com edition. I'm not sure where to find it on the other ones. So hold on. Early Church Fathers. And I'm going to go with Indication of the Way to the Kingdom of Heaven.
Is that by St. Tikhon or
Saint Innocent of Alaska?
Okay.
And we hope that answers your question, FG, and hopefully you can give us feedback on what you've learned the next show.
Okay, right. So with the Fifth Council, after its conclusion, it seems it took about 150 years, from what I understand, for all the actual Orthodox different sees to fully not just recognize its decrees. People didn't really have an issue with the dogmatic decree, but they actually recognized everything about it and counted it as fully authoritative and numbered it as the Fifth Ecumenical Council. So
it's the one they threw Vigilius in jail, right?
Yeah, that was probably that. Yeah, exactly. So that was a big issue with people objecting to parts about it. For example, and now, are you still there, Father?
Yes, I am.
Okay. In fact, after the Emperor Saint Justinian died, there was a big political reaction in Constantinople to how everything had been done at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. I think the Emperor Justin II became emperor. I think he was like the nephew of you can look that up. I think he was a nephew of Justinian. And according to St. John of Biclero, St. John of Biclero was a Spanish bishop, Bishop of Biclero, who had been exiled by the Visigothic Arians out of Spain because they accused him of being like a Byzantine spy. And so he was exiled to Constantinople for like 17 years. So he lived in the city for all this time. And St. John of Biclero says during the time of the Emperor Justin, a council was held in Constantinople that made this decision where people didn't have to accept all the condemnations of the three chapters. It was an attempt to moderate things because there was this political instability. And the Emperor Justin II, in order to try to stop, because remember, technically Milan at this point had broken communion actually over the condemnation of the three chapters even. And this was a really big issue. And so the Emperor Justin II issued with his bishops, they kind of wrote this document called the Henoticon, not to be confused with the much more ill-famed Henoticon of the Monophysites. Right. And the Henoticon, it just means union document is what it means, and a oneness document. And the document they signed with Milan and the Northern Italian bishops was that as long as that they did not have to accept everything, all the acts of the council. They didn't have to accept the full extremity of the posthumous condemnations, but they still had to accede to the dogmatic declarations, and everybody was fine with that. All right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, and they tried to do the same thing with Aquileia and parts of some of the Dalmatian bishops, but they were much more extreme on the position that if anybody accepted anything about it, then they're out of communion with us. And so things kind of progressed that way. We have letters from Saint Gregory the Great in the 590s, where he's writing to Queen Theodolinda, I believe. If I recall correctly, he was the wife of the Lombard Arian king, but she herself was not Arian, but she was part of this Istrian schism that was kind of the anti-three chapters schism.
Right.
And he was trying to this is where Saint Gregory kind of defends. He says he venerates the four Gospels as the four councils as the four books of the Gospels, but he also states that he venerates the Fifth Ecumenical Council as the Book of Acts. That is just like the interpretation of the previous Gospels. It's not contradictory to them.
Right.
So things kind of drag on. When most of the Istrian schism ends in the 620s. By the year 700, the issue had kind of become a dead issue. No one ever, and no one really cared much about the posthumous condemnation of Theodore Mopsuestia, mostly because a lot of his writings were a little excerpts from his writings were put down and sent to a bunch of people, and people kind of realized that he really was secretly a heretic, that he wasn't just some guy who had, because people in the West didn't know a lot about him. All they knew was that Ibis and Theodore and so had supposedly been died in the peace. Theodore Mopsuestia has supposedly died in the peace of the church, and all the rest. So the issue kind of dies out by 700, and everybody has no problem with the Fifth Council by that time. And anyway, so we get to the Sixth Ecumenical Council. There's really not an issue with that, because the Sixth Ecumenical Council, when you're dealing with that issue, you're dealing really with getting the Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria to acknowledge Orthodoxy to begin with. You're not dealing with Orthodox bishops, getting them to acknowledge, technical points of the canons or technical points of the Acts of the Council and such. Now, an interesting point is when we come to the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Now, as people may or may not know, when the Seventh Ecumenical Council was held in Nicaea in 787, Constantinople, the so-called Ecumenical Patriarchate, and most of the bishops in the Byzantine Empire had not been part of the church since around, let's say, 730 or 731. There had been, in fact, two councils in Rome, one in 729 and one in 731, where they basically anathematized and condemned the ecumenical. They anathematized and condemned iconoclasm, and communion was broken between the Western sees and Constantinople. And in the early 730s, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria followed suit. All right. And so when they held, and so there were numerous councils in this intermediate period where they were condemning iconoclasm in the West and in the Middle East, in the Melkite patriarchates in the Middle East. And Constantinople and its dependencies were simply considered schismatics and heretics. So the Seventh Ecumenical Council comes along, and Patriarch Tiresias, they open the council. I believe the legate from the Pope was the Cardinal Archpriest Peter. Someone says, why were no patriarchs of the Council of Hieria, or were they invited or summoned thanks? Well, Council of Hieria, I believe, is an iconoclast council. There were no patriarchs because they regarded it as heretical. They would not go. In fact, there was a council, this is meeting held in France, in Gentilly in 767, in which representatives of the iconoclast heretics came, and they wanted to try to convince various Frankish figures to assent to iconoclasm. But they would not do it, and the reaction was 2 years later in 769, a council was held in the Lateran in Rome, in which they again, for a third time, had a conciliar decision anathematizing iconoclasm. Now, the reason anybody went to the Second Council of Nicaea, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, was because one, Patriarch St. Paul IV, who died in 785, when he became patriarch, after he became patriarch, he came to the conclusion that iconoclasm was a heresy, and he repented. and he publicly announced he could not serve as patriarch because he didn't believe he was part of the church. And when the emperor, the empress, and the Senate asked him, "What should we do?" Patriarch St. Paul IV, who was regarded as a saint because he did go join an Orthodox monastery before he died and died in the church, Patriarch Paul said that we've been in schism and heresy from the Catholic and Apostolic Church for 50 years. We have to hold a council for us to get readmitted back into the church because none of us are really or anything. Patriarch Paul's like, I'm not a bishop. I'm not nothing. I have no apostolic succession. So now the problem comes with that in the intervening 2 periods, people like Patriarch Tiresias, he's consecrated. And when they hold the council, a lot of the monks who are at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, if you read the first session, the acts of the first session, they do not want to recognize Patriarch St. Tiresias or anybody because they're like, well, they're consecrated by schismatic heretics who were in turn consecrated by deposed heretics who in turn, going back 3 or 4 generations of so-called consecrations. And the monks were even challenging whether he was even validly baptized. And so the first acts of the council was, in fact, this discussion about how to even receive people like Patriarch Tiresias. And it ended up, the conclusion was that you could receive people who had been ordained by heretics and schismatics by some form of repentance, all right, without doing the whole of the reordination and all the rest. But before that happens, obviously, they had to accept the condemnation of iconoclasm and they had to accede to the Orthodox doctrine. So there were representatives at the Seventh Ecumenical Council from Rome. There was the legate Archpriest Peter. There were representatives from Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch. That did happen. And everybody kind of at the end of the council signs the decisions. Now, at the council, before the final horos, or dogmatic decree of the Seventh Ecumenical Council was issued, there were numerous decisions. I think there was a dogmatic epistle of Pope St. Adrian that was read. There was a dogmatic epistle, I know, of the Patriarch of Jerusalem that was read. I believe there are other dogmatic letters and epistles of Patriarch of Alexandria and Antioch, I believe, that were read, in which they were simply saying that we want, this is the Orthodox doctrine, you must assent to it, all right? And the final dogmatic decree of the council is perceived then as an assent to already previously made decisions. And its culmination is considered the readmission of all the bishops of the Ecumenical Patriarchate back into the church, even though none of them had been part of the church for several decades, or had never been in the church to begin with. Now, when the council ends, problems kind of begin. When the legates get back to Rome, Pope St. Adrian has no problem accepting the dogmatic decree of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, because in his view, and the view of the Roman bishops, this decree simply was already confirming what we're teaching, all right? The problem is that Pope St. Adrian and the Roman bishops had demanded that southern Italy, Sicily, and Illyrica Major, or Illyria, which is what we consider modern-day Greece, Macedonia, parts of the Balkans, should be returned to the jurisdiction of the Roman Patriarchate. Because during the Iconoclast period, the Iconoclast emperor had expelled all the Orthodox bishops who commemorated, because these areas originally commemorated the Pope. The Iconoclast heretic emperor expelled all of the Orthodox bishops and replaced them with heretical iconoclasts. And now that these areas began to say that they recognize the Iconoclast Patriarch of Constantinople. So when the Seventh Ecumenical Council ends, these ostensibly iconoclast bishops renounce iconoclasm, become Orthodox bishops, but they're still recognizing the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And the position of the Roman bishops and the bishops in various parts of Italy who agreed with Pope St. Adrian was that it's great you are now back into the church and you accept Orthodoxy, but you still got to give us the stuff. You took the stuff away from us, you got to return it back over.
Back jurisdiction. Exactly.
And I believe Patriarch St. Tiresias was sympathetic, but he told the legates of the council that politically this is not going to be possible, because if we say this, the imperial government, there might be some kind of instability. There might be because there's probably issues of like monetary money coming from these sees going to the government or something like that. So they kind of agreed at the council not to discuss it that much. But when the legates get back, they're not, Pope St. Adrian's not too happy. But Pope St. Adrian's in a position where he's like, I cannot condemn the council because I'm not going to throw St. Tiresias and the other bishops who repented and became part of the church again under the bus. I can't do that. But he says, I'm not going to call it ecumenical. I'm just going to accept it as a local council of Constantinople that brought them back into the church. And that's how for some time,
Rome's position was. Ironically, the so-called, oftentimes by historians, the Melkite Patriarchates, which by that they don't mean union, they mean the Orthodox Patriarchates of Antioch. Yeah, their position was in fact very similar. For example, Jerusalem, continuously in Jerusalem liturgical documents, they never mentioned the Seventh Ecumenical Council until around like 1110 or 1120. That's not because they assented to iconoclasm, because they had to have their own decisions in the 740s and 50s condemning iconoclasm as a heresy. It's their position was simply that, well, you know, this was a Council of Constantinople. It's nice they call it ecumenical. We accept its dogmatic decisions, but it was them coming back and joining the church, not us assenting to them making demands on us. And Antioch, I believe, consistently only began to label the Second Council of Nicaea as Seventh Ecumenical around the 14th or 15th century. Now, Saint Photius, in fact, complains in the lead up to the 879, what we consider to really be the Eighth Ecumenical Council, that the other patriarchates were not listing the Seventh Ecumenical Council as technically ecumenical. They were like accepting it and such, but they weren't calling it ecumenical. They were just treating it as a local council of Constantinople, right? So, and you know, and technically, you know, so, and even as late as like the 999, even after, let's say, the legates of Pope John VIII came back, even though they had signed the acts of the Eighth Ecumenical Council, and Pope John assented to essentially the acts of the council, he still technically didn't want to call that the Eighth Ecumenical Council for some time. Although people did call it, although that's a controversial issue, because there were some Roman popes who would call it the Eighth Ecumenical Council, some that did not. And this, because you have even someone like Pope Sylvester II in the 990s who lists there only being 6 ecumenical councils. But no one really, in their right mind, would say that somehow he was teaching iconoclasm any more than the Antiochians were. All right? So that's an interesting point now of how long it took this. So there's a difference between a council being accepted for its dogmatic decrees and content, all right, and actually calling the council the full title of ecumenical, because that, you know, because that implies more than acceptance of dogmatic decrees. That implies acceptance of canonical decisions, of various, other decisions made by the acts. For example, there was a council held in Rome in 649 called the Lateran Synod of 649, which was, in fact, proclaimed at the council. All the bishops, including the Pope, St. Martin, said this is an ecumenical council, all right? And they had all kinds of dogmatic canons and chapters and decrees against monothelitism. But in the end, even Rome didn't accept it as an ecumenical council, even though they accepted the dogmatic decrees of their own council, all right? So, as you noted, Father, sometimes how long it takes for a council to be ecumenical and what does it mean to accept it fully can be sometimes decades or even sometimes centuries.
The other now I'm going to flip that to the modern era, because that's definitely relevant to now. And what I'm referring to is the so-called Pan-Orthodox Synod of 2016. Now we're going to get into the distinction between Pan-Orthodox and ecumenical shortly, but if I don't know if you remember, in the lead up to the council, there was a lot of advertising that was basically claiming that the Patriarch was going to make an ecumenical council. And they've been saying that they had it in the works for 50 years. They said it for the past 20 before 2016 that this was going to be in it. Then slowly it started to morph into the Pan-Orthodox Council. And then now it's not really much of a council at all.
Well, a lot of people in the Ecumenical Patriarchate, to them, it's already authoritative.
Well, to them, but to who else? That's my point.
Well, again, it's a different issue, because remember, according to that Archbishop John in Ukraine, the one who was like the big non-commemorator, later went to being back to be a commemorator.
Okay.
I can't remember his name. The name of the see, but when he was at a session of the Ecumenical of the Moscow Patriarchate in the late 2016, I believe, after the creed had ended, Patriarch Kirill actually tried to get a lot of the Russian the Moscow Patriarchate bishops, to fully sign off on everything, because he was saying that there's nothing wrong with the council. It's just we didn't agree with it for political reasons, and it was going to create instability inside of the Moscow Patriarchate.
So he tried to get him to sign the 2016 things,
Yeah, well, they kind of left it as an open question. In fact, according to this Archbishop John in Ukraine, his point was that, because he was like attacking Kirill over this, saying that Kirill agreed in essence with the Cretan decrees, like the documents. All right. But the problem was that Kirill did not want to accept the council because he was afraid of new non-commemoration movements breaking out in Moscow Patriarchy. All right. So the question is like, is it a dead letter or is it not? I mean, they're already implementing decisions they had already undertaken. For example, normatively allowing second marriages for clergy and such.
Now that's an interesting thing. So, like, basically, what you're saying is, and I sense that was true with Kirill at least. But what you're saying is basically, so these non-recognizing churches that didn't accept the council, in fact, did accept the council.
Well, this is what happened apparently is Patriarch Kirill said that there's nothing wrong with the documents. The documents are all quote unquote orthodox, which is laughable to call those documents orthodox. And that the only reason he could not get it through, accepted, officially proclaimed in the Moscow Patriarchate had to do with the fact that he was afraid of a large number of monasteries and clergy becoming non-commemorators openly. Because if that would mean the Moscow Patriarchate would even be more officially committed to an ecumenical agenda, and people already people in the Moscow Patriarchate were already becoming non-commemorators over Kirill meeting with Francis in Cuba, and having that joint ecumenical statement. So, and I don't, for some reason, I guess Kirill didn't think there would be such a big reaction to it, but there was, and they've tried to kind of dampen it down and make, bind things up and do all the rest, all right, and hope things blow over, all right.
Yeah, and then the Ukraine thing happened.
Yeah, and that's kind of consuming most of their time and such, So that puts anything else on the back burner.
Now, for anyone who does not commemorate, however, that council is worthless. So
yeah, I mean, for us it's worthless. We wouldn't regard it. It was to us it was worthless from the outstart.
Yeah, it was to watch.
I mean, again, it's like someone was asking about the Council of Hierarchy, which was an iconoclast council held in the 760s. I mean, to us, it'd be like the Council of Hierarchy. We wouldn't, it'd be a council of heretical people. The Ecumenical Patriarchate being the chief heresiarch there, and such. I mean, and what was so ridiculous about Crete was that even Antioch, which is generally very ecumenical, ecumenists didn't even go because they were not in communion with Jerusalem at the time. They're still not in communion with Jerusalem.
I thought they worked out a deal with Jerusalem.
You're right. They may have worked out a deal. But the point is that over the centuries, you can have heretics hold false councils, and the church basically immediately rejects those things. All right, because it's like we're not even part of that. The church can hold. You can have a council that can be held, that can be proclaimed to be ecumenical, and can have correct dogmatic decrees on let's say the Christological issues it's called, like the Lateran Synod of 649. But at the end, the church does not say we're going to give it the title ecumenical.
They will keep the council as part of her heritage, but
yes, but calling it exactly, but calling it ecumenical is a whole different thing than just accepting. Let's say it had correct dogmatic decrees. Yeah. All right. Like, for example, there's the 1672 Synod of Jerusalem, in which we accept the 18 decrees of the so-called confession of Patriarch Dositheus. But we generally don't say that that's an ecumenical council. I mean, it was a council mostly of Jerusalem, I think about 20 or 30 Jerusalem Patriarch bishops and a few other representatives. And when the decrees of that council were sent to the other Orthodox churches, everybody accepted them. All right? They still didn't feel a need to say, we're going to give it the title ecumenical. All right? It's just a council that assented to and proclaimed the consciousness of the church. So it seems for it to be ecumenical, it has to have a number of things. I guess we'd have to say what generally there's an emperor involved, I believe.
You'd have to have a representative of the Christian public.
Exactly, of the Christian public, of the Christian population by the ruler. 2, it have to be assented to be called ecumenical by originally the Pentarchy, and later, I guess you'd say, by all the churches. Okay, and 3, of course, we should say primarily the content of the council should be Orthodox to begin with. All right, and that's part of the reception of the consciousness of the church receiving. All right, because otherwise you could have the Pope or Patriarch or whoever promoting it, and like the 5th council, the Pope could be trying to get people to accept it, and they'd be like, "No, we're going to accept part of it, but not all of it."
Yeah. Okay. Now it should be noted, from at least from my perspective, and tell me if I'm wrong here, Paul, but pan-Orthodox synods that are accepted by the church carry a similar weight to the ecumenical councils. We have value in councils that are not ecumenical to begin with, but if they are orthodox and correct and have the correct dogmatic teaching, it doesn't need to necessarily be ecumenical in order for it to be accepted by the church.
Sure. I mean, for example, there's the 1285 Synod of Blacherny.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which I think contains an explicit, one of the most explicit condemnations of the filioque. I think that's contains a extremely explicit condemnation of the filioque heresy, written by Patriarch Saint Gregory II of Cyprus. There is another synod in the late 1100s in Constantinople, 1150s, which condemned various heresies that were denying the real presence and denying the Eucharistic sacrifice. And these were basically accepted when the decrees were sent out. The other churches, even if the other patriarchates were like, yeah, we accept this. This is Orthodox, and when you have, for example, when you had like what was often called the Palamite synods, there were 3 Palamite synods, so-called, which some people call the Ninth Ecumenical Council. But when those were sent out, initially you did have some patriarchates that were not familiar with all the newer terminology, and they were kind of reticent about it. All right, but after a few years, everybody accepted it once it was explained correctly. All right.
Now, hold on. We got a question.
Okay.
This was an interesting one. What is the big fear? It's from Son of Seth. What is the big fear of non-Chalcedonians accepting the two natures of Christ? Do you feel it's a genuine apprehension? Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a genuine apprehension on their part. I mean, admitting you're wrong for 1,500 years is kind of a thing. It's an issue.
But do you think that's more the issue that they this point they have 1,500 years of invested in it that even they can't go back?
I think that's a large part of it. And I think also, I mean, if we look at their perspective now in the 21st century, I mean, they just celebrated with the
Patriarch of Serbia and Antioch.
Yeah, and so the point is, from their perspective, they've got the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I mean, we're just like schismatic fanatics on the internet saying they're wrong, and they can say the Patriarch of Serbia and Antioch is doing services with us. Who are you to say anything else?
Yeah, exactly. So the point is, they're more interested in acceptance than they are in true doctrine. True doctrine, in my opinion. And I think a lot of that is personal, emotional. And so, yeah, I'd say it's a genuine apprehension. But I wouldn't say it's based on true understanding of doctrine.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there was somebody, I can't remember the fellow on the War Room that was also pointing out that a lot of the objections the Monophysites had for like oftentimes are these little things like, oh, why didn't the bishop so and so at the Council of Chalcedon say something after this letter was read? I mean, they're like they end up going to kind of these little petty minutia type things.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now, one point we should address, though, about the reception of a council is that what the Pope says or does not say did not necessarily make a council ecumenical. So, I mean, you have the case of the church just most of the church acceded to the Second Ecumenical Council, even though basically Pope St. Damasus was like, I'm not going, we're not sending anybody because we don't recognize the guy head of the council. All right, and they just held a council anyway.
Yep.
They may have not liked what Pope St. Damasus said, and they may have been not happy that he wasn't there, but they weren't going to be. They were still opening a council, and they actually called it ecumenical when they opened it, even though Damasus had no representatives there. All right, even though technically Pope St. Damasus, the view of him and the Italian bishops was that St. Meletius was not even really ordained. He was basically an unordained, because they said he was ordained by Arian heretics, and so they weren't going to accept him. And I believe St. Cyril of Jerusalem was at the Second Ecumenical Council as well, and he wasn't in communion with Rome at the time because they said he was ordained by Arian heretics, and they would not accept his ordination. I know St. Jerome was really not very friendly to him, and he was a big involved.
Yeah,
he did not. Because remember, St. Jerome was a supporter of Paulinus of Antioch. He was the Roman candidate in Antioch for some time. So the point is that they held a council, they condemned Arianism again, condemned Macedonianism again. A large part of the Second Ecumenical Council was trying to get all these disparate Orthodox groups that had been against Arianism but hated each other back together. Rome doesn't want to participate because it doesn't like who the president of the council is. It doesn't even accept him as a bishop, and it's not in communion with him. But yet they still proceed to call the council ecumenical and hold it. All right? And at that point, it's this fait accompli situation. where the emperor Saint Theodosius, he becomes emperor of the United Empire. He's from Spain himself, all right, like Saint Hosius originally, even though Saint Hosius was, and so you have a Westerner become emperor in Constantinople, and eventually Rome has no choice but to accept the council and just give some little pittance about, well, we don't accept this canon, but we accept everything else, because of course they accept the full creed, all right. Secondly, when you have the letter of St. Leo read at the Fourth Ecumenical Council, the bishops reserve the right to investigate the letter and say, does this agree with St. Cyril and the church teaching, or does it not?
Yeah,
right?
When you look at the Acts of the Council, they actually go through the letter.
Yeah, and they were very happy to say, St. Leo is teaching like St. Peter, because it was, but it wasn't a necessary thing that the letter was automatically, because if the letter was automatically going to be considered Orthodox no matter what it said, why even hold a council? A council has no real purpose at that point.
Exactly. Now, and of course, we have to come to the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which I've mentioned this before, but I love mentioning it for all our new listeners, which is that the Pope did not want to accept the actions of the council, and the council threw him in jail. I love saying that, and just remember that.
And they removed his name from the diptychs.
And they threw him in jail.
Well, it's interesting. Emperor Charles the Bold in the 860s, late 850s or early 860s, when either Pope Nicholas or his successor was interfering in the church in France, and that the Emperor Charles the Bold, the Frankish bishop said, they wrote a letter to the Pope Nicholas, and they said, we would hate to have to undertake the actions that were taken by the Emperor Justinian a few hundred years ago.
Oh, wow, really? I've never read that letter, but I want.
If you read Father Vladimir Guitte's book, The Papacy,
it was in there?
He talks about this.
Oh,
in other words, what's happening is they were saying that if you continue to try to depose bishops without holding councils in France and interfere, because Nicholas and people kind of made a lot of people upset, not just St. Photius.
Yeah.
The concept was that they basically arrest him, and they and that gives all and there's all this credence. Some Roman Catholics have this theory that supposedly St. Photius was controlling the Frankish Empire to attack the Pope at the time, and it's just kind of crazy anyway. But
just for those who haven't read it, The Papacy by Abba Guite, which I read like 20 years ago, is a fantastic book with a lot of
free on Google Books. You can get it free.
Free on Google Books. You don't have to buy it, and it is. I had no idea. I'd forgotten it if I'd read that. Wow.
It's got a lot of interesting stuff.
That's pretty funny. I didn't realize that an emperor actually threatened to do.
No, it's not. Hold on a second. It's either in Father Vladimir Guitte's book, or it actually, where it may be.
No.
It may actually be in Tentativa Theologica.
Oh, really?
It actually may be in Antio Figueroa's book, who was
okay. That is also a really
that's actually a good book. Now, he of course was one of the last Portuguese Gallicans, and he kind of like Ultramontane, kind of won out and all the rest. But Tentativa Theologica has a lot of interesting information about the period.
Atomic Lead asks us, on a similar vein as all of this, have you by chance seen Kabani the Christian's video on why not to be a Roman Catholic, and have any thoughts on it?
No, I've not watched anything like that.
I haven't seen it either. He's done interesting work, and a lot of it is it's very well read, but I haven't seen the video.
I remember him from many years ago. He did stuff like defending the authenticity of the prophecies concerning Christ as Messiah. I kind of remember some of that stuff. But that was like 15 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, and I remember he used to do that a lot. He has a website. He's on the war zone.
Yeah.
But in any case, that's no, we haven't seen it. If you want to give us a gist of what it is, and we can throw our thoughts that way. Otherwise, we'd have to watch it.
But one of the interesting points I'd like to make about the reception of the Seventh Ecumenical Council is that the fact that some Roman Catholics say, well, a council depends upon the Pope's approval, and when he approves it, then it can be called ecumenical, and that's a special prerogative of, let's say, the Bishop of Rome, right? Well, if that was the case, why would the Patriarch of Antioch, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the Patriarch of Alexandria? It takes them 200 years before they're willing to call the Seventh Ecumenical Council by the title ecumenical, even though they accepted the dogmatic decree. So a lot of this has to do with how churches receive, how churches decide to receive a council. It's not just, unless the Patriarch of Antioch and Alexander were claiming some kind of special apostolic see privilege or something like that. But Jerusalem made the same claim. All right. So I don't know what much more to add, Father Joseph. Any point?
I can tell you the origin of that particular teaching. That literally comes from the Dictatus Papae. And if you look in the Dictatus Papae, which we've referenced before, Hildebrand 1075, number 16 says, no synod shall be called a, quote, general synod without the Pope's order. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for the actual origin of where this teaching that the Pope must ratify or approve the council, that's where it is. 1075, as the Roman Catholic Church began to be born and the Orthodoxy of the West died.
Well, of course, at this point, everybody acknowledges that there are 7 ecumenical. All the Orthodox acknowledge there are 7 ecumenical councils, maybe 8 ecumenical councils. Yeah. So that's it's mandatory at this point. You can't go back to the 9th century and say, well, I've decided to accept this council and this part and this part and this part.
Well, the worst part was the switcheroo that was done with 879 and 869. Mm-hmm. Because Rome did accept 879 for about I think it was
about 200 years.
Yeah, and then after the schism, after the Hildebrandian Revolution, they said no, the 869 council is a real.
Wasn't there a canon, a post-schism canonist in the early 1100s who was even calling the 879 council ecumenical?
That's correct. I forget which one it was. It's not David Garrett, but. It was there was another one. He listed the 8th Council as 879, but then eventually they changed that up, and so that's what happened there.
Okay, Son of Seth says, would you say that statues like some found in Western quote unquote Catholicism are not permitted as valid icons? Thanks. Okay, Father, what do you say?
That's a tough one. And what I mean by a tough one is that if you're talking about a statue, Roman Catholicism. It is not the same thing as a statue in the 8th or 9th or 7th century. Statues in that period were much flatter and much more similar to what we call bas-relief, the kind of raised icon that covers an icon or the raised body of a sculpture. It was not like a freestanding image. And there have been attempts to say, look at this ancient icon, it's freestanding. You can clearly see it was flat and originally on the wall. So the point is, their concept of the statuary in the Western Church was not the same as it is in Roman Catholicism today. You didn't have, people with the crazy eye faces and the bleeding.
I mean, even when they say statua, are they really meaning the same thing as statue 1,000 years later?
They're not, and historical evidence will point that out. What you want to do is look up. You want to look up ancient statues of Christ. You want to look up ancient statues or ancient Orthodox icon statues, and you'll begin to see, if you paid attention to Orthodox icons, that the statuary they're talking about is not the same as what's in Roman Catholicism today.
For example, have you ever seen a statuary where you have the figure kind of like, I guess that's bas relief, where it's like you have half of them coming out of the wall?
That's exactly what it is.
Almost like it's a carving out of wood or stone.
And there are actually, I think even some root screens look like that.
Yeah, well, no, I know in the Novgorod region in Russia, they had a lot of carved iconography.
Yeah, there was a famous one of St. Nicholas, which they try to say, well, look at that, that's a statue. And yeah, sure, it's flat though, and it's barely 3.
But I would also point out that I think you can find. I will admit you can find probably in late antiquity, which is, let's say, 400s. I think the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople was supposed to have the statues of painted statues of 12 Holy Apostles in the temple on screen. Though the question is that, again, what do they mean by statue when they said statue?
Yeah,
secondly, was this the profoundly normative thing throughout the church? Well, even if they did have that, that's because there is a famous statue of Hodegetitria, a Byzantine statue from the 9th century, which is kind of like about 14 inches tall or something like that. Yeah, there were a few of these, But even those are kind of thin. Like you turn them to the side, it's like, was the Theotokos that thin? You know?
No, well, it's flat. That's what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see here. Actually, I'm going to look that one up.
Christopher says, I think, or Boniface says, I think the main problem is the lack of a halo, and that's a good point. Otherwise, you'd have to create, that's why if you have bas relief, you can put a halo kind of around in the back of it, or you'd have to create like a halo carving out of the top of it, you know? So, what are you looking up, Father?
I was looking up the Hydratria statue because, to my memory, that's a pretty flat statue. But
I should mention, even in iconography, it was not universal that you always had halos in late antiquity and early medieval. For example, if you look at some of the mosaics in Ravenna, not Ravenna, but in St. Catherine's on Sinai, you have Christ with his halo with a cross on it, but then you might have other figures that don't have a halo in them.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm now by the end of the Middle Age, by the end of let's say the 700s or something like that, all iconography universally, east and west, everybody had kind of the halo. The only reason we know about this is that St. Catherine's was never affected by iconoclasm, and so they preserved a lot of like 4th and 5th century iconography and such. That's why if you look at the iconography in St. Catherine's, it actually has a kind of a more similarity to some extent between late antiquities painting techniques, and that once iconoclasm happens, there's this, according to some Orthodox art historians, I suppose, kind of this reaction to double down on things and such. But it doesn't destroy the continuity of the iconographic tradition, nevertheless.
Yeah, so, I mean, ultimately, to answer your question, the kind of statuary that you'd be talking about as acceptable in Orthodoxy is much more limited than what Roman Catholicism has created. So, I mean, I know a lot of people like their statues, but it's just not.
I mean, I know the Byzantines had statues of the emperor, but that's like not the same as an icon.
You're not supposed to kiss an icon. You're not supposed to.
Well, no, they did kiss the feet of the emperor statues, and they did light candles and offer incense to it. That was in fact done.
Wow.
But it was done because the concept was that the emperor is a living man. Let's say that to begin with. So he's not. You don't have to paint the emperor as if he's like an iconographic figure in the kingdom of heaven.
Although they do paint him. They did that in what country recently where they painted the president in there.
Well, I'm saying you don't have to do that. My point is that, for example, you go back to the 4th century. In the 4th century period, once the emperors became Orthodox Christian, and they renounced claims of being divine, of being gods on earth, of having like their genius inhabit statues and things like that, St. Jerome, St. Gregory, and others mentioned that the church dropped the objections to kissing the picture of the emperor or to kissing the feet of the statue of the emperor in each of the cities. Because at that point, it was interpreted as just the respect paid to the image was given to the man who was just a man. Right? At that point, there was no objection. So they would light candles and they'd offer incense to the statue of the emperor or to his portrait in some cases. All right, because that was simply interpreted as it's like pledging allegiance to the flag or having the picture of the whatever. It kind of sounds like you go to these third world countries and they have like the picture of the president and everybody's got to respect it or whatever.
You didn't even find that here.
Yeah, I guess yeah, exactly. So so it wasn't like the Byzantines couldn't make statues. They did in fact continue to make statues of the emperor. But the concept is that could the statue, the full 3D classical statue, could that fully represent everything that we wanted to represent in iconography? And I think it's probably could. I don't think it can. I don't think it can.
Unless it's attached to the wall.
But then it's not. But then you're not talking about classical
proper statue.
You're talking about something heavily modified. All right. And of course you're always going to find, for example, there were Orthodox reliquaries that are like silver. Their hands, they look like they're like I've seen them before. They look like they're from like the elbow to the end of the hand, like the forearm. It looks like
because the relic was of that body.
Yeah, exactly. And priests would be like the relic of the hand inside of it, or a relic in the hand, and they would make the sign of the cross, and people would venerate it. But that's a fancy reliquary more than anything else. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I think we may have covered the main issues. Anything else to discuss, Father?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I want to definitely hammer down the idea that a pan-Orthodox council, a true pan-Orthodox council, carries the weight of an ecumenical council. Because one of the main objections that you'll hear from Roman Catholics is you guys don't have ecumenical councils anymore. Well, we don't have emperors anymore. But the point is, the real deeper question there is a question of authority. Does the church maintain authority? And of course the answer is yes. That's never changed, even if the wording of the council has changed.
For example, again, as I mentioned, we had there was a famous Council of Constantinople, 1150s, which everybody accepted. There was the Blachernae Synod, everybody accepts. There are the 3 Palamite Synods that all the church accepts. I mean,
3 16th century synods, which all the churches accept.
Exactly. So, if we're choosing to call them pan-Orthodox and everybody accepts their decrees, is that how fundamentally is that different? I mean, at an essential level from it being an ecumenical council, other than the fact that ecumenical implies approval by all these patriarchates in some formal sense, and then the emperor being at the council.
Yeah. But if there's no emperor, obviously.
Yeah. But then again, can the church call an ecumenical council without an emperor? I think it could, maybe.
You'd
Why not?
still need a secular leader.
Yeah, but okay. But the point is that if we didn't have an emperor and we came to correct dogmatic decisions, it would still, the church still accepts those decisions.
But it would still have to be an Orthodox. It would still have to be an Orthodox state. Like,
yes.
If say the president of Poland suddenly became Orthodox and promoted Orthodoxy throughout the region, and suddenly decided to hold a true council and call true bishops, then yeah, it could be done.
Yeah, and this also may explain why this Lateran Council of 649 was never accepted as ecumenical, even though it was explicitly called ecumenical by everybody of the council. Like Pope St. Martin, they were saying, by the grace of the Holy Spirit, we declare this council ecumenical.
But I think Pope St. Martin also noted that the emperor didn't support it. So
no, he knew the emperor didn't support it, but he still called it ecumenical. And that may be why in the 680s, the popes were like, well, we're not going to... They really decided they didn't want to call Lateran ecumenical anymore because of that issue.
Right.
Because what's the point if they're going to hold the Sixth Ecumenical Council and it's going to be a political issue? Are they going to ram it down the emperor's throat that they're going to have to accept, this council which flaunted his father's authority? So.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right, that covers it. Is there any other questions? We'll wait for a minute or two.
Any discussions on the war zone recently?
Let me take a look. There's been a few. Let's go for the war zone. Let's see. Still waiting. Okay. Well, you.
Now, I found it interesting.
Patriarchy.
There's an interesting discussion. What I was reading a book by Michael Lepage, who is a historian who translates a number of documents from the late Anglo-Saxon era, and I found a reference to a miracle-working image or icon of Saint Swithin from the 11th century. So it's interesting talking about miracle-working images.
Okay. I'm just wondering, I noticed that you put up this thing about the Patriarchate of Antioch.
Yes.
And someone said a change in the scales in the 13th century, ironically also the century, this is really becoming official.
Well, let's explain what the post was. The post explains how even in the 12th century or the 13th century, the Patriarch of Antioch was still by far the largest, I believe, or arguably one of the largest, if not the largest, of the Orthodox churches. For example, the 18th century, there's an 18th century Arabic writer called Michael Bayutska, I believe. Bayutska.
Correct.
Yeah, exactly. He was an 18th century priest in Orthodox priest in Damascus. And he says this. He says, after all this, at that time, there were in the eparchy, or Abrashaya of Antioch, that is directly in Syria, 153 bishops, the number of fish which came from the apostolic net in Tiberias. Besides this, there were the 4 great Catholicosites over which the Patriarch of Antioch had primacy. The first Catholicos is of Seleucia in Babylon, and all the lands of the east to India. In this eparchy, there are more than 100 bishops. The second is the Catholicos of Greater Armenia and its dependencies, in which there were 200 bishops. The third is the Catholicos of the Georgians, who has primacy over countless tribes and peoples. The fourth is the Catholicos of the Kata and the Katia, who were in the furthest east and north. That's modern-day Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Additionally, the Patriarch of Antioch had primacy over the island of Cyprus until the 5th Council, when they granted it its archbishop the honor of sole primacy. That was when Cyprus became autocephalous. And then in the 12th century, Nilos Doxopatrios, who was a deacon of Hagia Sophia, says in his book, The Notice of the Patriarchal Thrones, quote, that the Patriarch of Antioch had under his jurisdiction all of Asia and the East, including India. Even now he dispatches, after arranging it, Catholicos with the title of Romagius. In Persia also, which comprises Babylonia, now called Baghdad, the Patriarch sends a Catholicos with the title of Catholicos of Iranopolis. And notice, even after the Armenian Monophysite Syro-Jacobites and Nestorians broke away, the Patriarch of Antioch still was putting Orthodox bishops, to kind of replace them. He was putting Orthodox Catholicos in those areas to replace the apostate ones, because the Constantinople, they knew about this. And of course, a Catholicos is, for lack of a better word, kind of like the head of an autonomous church. That's how the Antiochians understood it. He was like kind of the primate metropolitan, and he only had to be confirmed by the patriarch.
Now, okay, we got a question.
But notice, however, that it really wasn't until the Mongol invasion destroyed Central Asia and then ravaged the Middle East, and the Orthodox population suffered terribly and was reduced. And with the then it was not until the Roman Catholics conquered the Americas and large portions of Africa and forced conversions that Roman Catholicism became really kind of a global religion and outnumbered the Orthodox.
Now, it was on I was on the other Orthodox apologetics site, the Orthodox Theology and Apologetics. Someone posted some actual terrifying numbers about how the Roman Catholic Church is literally imploding. And I bring that up only because you brought up that this is kind of where the Roman Catholic Church. It was only in the 13th century that got bigger, but
it was only in the discovery of the New World they got bigger.
But now here's the thing. Now, listen to some of these numbers; they're crazy. In 1958, 74% of Roman Catholics went to Sunday Mass.
How many?
74%.
Okay.
In 2000, 25% of Catholics went to Sunday Mass. And then in 1965, there were 1.3 million infant baptisms. In 2002, despite the population rise, there were 1 million infant baptisms. In some of the really mind-blowing stuff, ordinations. In 1965, there were 1,575 ordinations to the priesthood. In 2002, there were 450.
Well, how many in 1955?
In 1965, there were 1,575. In 2002, there were 450. Seminarians. In 1965, there were 49,000 seminarians enrolled. In 2002, there were 4,700.
Well, I think it's evident papism has been in complete collapse for the past 50 years.
Yeah, it's been a free fall. And so I think that's part of the reason why a lot of them are so desperate for the Orthodox to unite with them, because they're starting to fall apart.
Well, I mean, and they also recently had Francis going into this big ecumenical meeting with the so-called Patriarch of Romania. Yeah. Which is another travesty.
And that's going to, the point is, there's a ROCOR MP priest, Father Andrew Phillips, who wrote a pretty good essay where he basically warned, this is after he joined with the official church, he warns flat out that if they continue to do this ecumenism and continue in this modernism, we're just going to keep growing. We don't exist it's not like Roman Catholicism, where it's about people in union or not in union with the Pope. Being canonical does not determine anything about your status. It certainly doesn't determine whether you can make.
Well, the question of what is canonical to begin with.
I'm talking about the quote-unquote term.
Oh yeah. Father Joseph, I'll be back in like 30 seconds. Keep on talking.
Okay. And so all of this is largely irrelevant. And if you look at the history of the church, you see that it's even more irrelevant than really it could even be put historically. The history of the ecumenical councils, especially due to the fact that they struggled with the reception of these councils, indicates that there is no central authority in Orthodoxy. There never has been. It's not part of the teaching of our church, and so that's one of the things that is very clear from looking at the history of the ecumenical councils. I can't see how anyone could look at them and say this is definitely proof of a monarchical structure in Orthodoxy. It doesn't exist. It can't be created. Let me see. I will answer you, Boniface, on the question of the episode rebuking the Frankish Thesis. Frankish Thesis when Father Enoch comes back, because that's something we've been discussing. It's definitely worthwhile doing. Atomic lead rites are these numbers solely Vatican II 12 or something else. If you look for the causes, you can blame the general apostasy of society. I mean, we could look at all numbers all day and we could make theories. But the simple reality is St. John of Kronstadt predicted 100 years ago that the Roman Catholic Church as a human institution would collapse upon itself. And how it would do that, that was a mystery. Now it's not.
Julian Joseph Overbeck predicted back in the 1860s and 70s that after the 1870s, once the infallibility decree went through, he says, what's to stop Roman Catholicism, or what's to happen if the Pope decides he wants to pray or do services with pagans or heretics?
Well, welcome to that reality.
Exactly. I think that's what a lot of people back then saw that,
Yeah.
Because remember, if people forget, is modernism in Roman Catholicism was actually began in the 1960s. Now, it was technically suppressed, and they went underground, all right? But people like Overbeck and others kind of knew those people were still around, waiting in the wings, Freemasons and such.
And now, I want to get back to Boniface's question, because he said, when can we expect an episode review from the Frankish Thesis?
Well, can someone give a concise definition of the Frankish Thesis?
The Frankish Thesis is basically that the Church in the West, after the rise of Charlemagne and the successors in terms of the Holy Roman Empire, had basically altered the Church in the West to the point that it was already no longer Orthodox. In other words,
so the concept is that the Great. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
In other words, prior to the Great Schism, basically, Orthodoxy in the West was already dead.
So, like by 810 or 820, that their sacraments would have been already invalid.
Or getting in that as they did things, like usually the
you're either in the church or you're out of the church. Your sacraments are either valid or invalid. So, I mean, you got to say one thing or the other.
No, I agree. I agree with you. It would seem that that's obvious that.
Well, the first reason that's a problematic thesis to say that somehow, let's say, as soon as whatever Charlemagne did or didn't do, caused the whole church in the West to apostatize and their sacraments become invalid, is that, well, one, the Eastern patriarchates were still in communion with the Pope and with these bishops in the West.
Yep.
So why were they celebrating and doing services with them? If is it possible really to have all this contact? And there was contact. It wasn't like constant contact, but it was enough that you could get to know people. All right. I mean, for example, Pope St. Adrian and Pope St. Leo III are on the calendar, even in the Eastern Church. Okay, they apparently considered Charlemagne to be part of the church, even if they didn't like stuff he was doing or disagreed with policy or whatever.
Well, they certainly didn't excommunicate all his bishops.
Exactly, they didn't excommunicate all his bishops. All right, so here's the question: how can St. Leo III really be a saint and a sainted pope for 30, 20 years and be celebrating with heretics? And not really. I mean, now Romanides' idea is that he did it for political reasons. Well, that doesn't. If you're celebrating with heretics for 20 years or 30 years for political reasons, you're not a saint.
Yeah.
Right. So it creates a situation where they don't really. They're basically saying that, oh well, it was a faux communion. The popes may have been Orthodox, and they were basically doing stuff for Frankish bishops, so they knew we're heretics and they didn't care. And the Eastern Church kind of knew this and it didn't care or turned a blind eye.
One thing that
that destroys the concept of the unity of the Orthodox Catholic Church at that point.
And more importantly, another thing that I've noticed, because really the Frankish Thesis is a really modern thesis, and people don't realize that it doesn't have long standing in Orthodox teaching concerning the schism. And what I mean by that is one of the accusations that Romanides and other people have put forth is that the Franks were over reliant on Augustine. St. Augustine, and they were but basically the reason for this is because Romanides' argument is that St. Augustine's not really a saint either, and that he did not understand what the Orthodox teaching was. Which, to be quite frank, if you read a lot of St. Augustine's teachings, it's insane what he's saying. So I think that this is the Frankish Thesis.
Now the Frankish Thesis goes back earlier than Charlemagne, though. There was a fellow on the war zone who was a Serbian patriarchate priest who was like extreme Romanidian, and he was saying that the Franks were never part of the church, never. And so I said, well, what about St. Exactly. And so I said, wait a minute, St. Remigius was a consecrated bishop back in the 460s. He was a Gallo-Roman. He baptized Frankish children. What happened when he baptized the Frankish baby? And the guy wouldn't answer. So my question is, did the baby not become part of the church when St. Remigius baptized somebody? What happened when St. Remigius baptized St. Clovis? Did he not become part of the church? I mean, it's one thing you can say King Clovis was kind of this barbarian who was ignorant and knew only the simple concepts of the faith, but that's true of a lot of people. All right. So you had this continuous line of people, like St. Gregory and others, St. Gregory of Tours, who was a Gallo-Roman, but then when they were baptizing Frankish children, were those children not becoming part of the church? I mean, it makes a mockery. It creates a mockery situation where there's so much. For some reason, there's this Hellenic ethnic hatred for Germanic. I don't know what's going on there.
I don't even think
there's some sort of chauvinism going on there. Definitely against some kind of Greek chauvinism going on there somehow.
Well, now Boniface wrote they sometimes refer to St. Photius as criticism on Frankish missionaries.
Yeah, well, exactly. Really the Bavarian missionaries. They weren't Franks. They're actually Bavarian missionaries that were going into Slavonic areas and Bulgaria and trying to promote the Filioque and trying to promote, basically the Filioque and celibate priesthood.
Well, this is another problem, is that Romanides also doesn't distinguish between Frankish groups sometimes, and then he does when it's convenient to his thesis.
Bavarians are not Franks, by the way. I mean, so, there was a valid criticism, and I don't think any of us are going to say that it was correct for these German missionaries to be going to Slavic lands and promoting the Filioque.
Well, we should point out that was St. Photius' valid criticisms, not Romanides.
Yeah, exactly. That's St. Photius' criticisms. In fact, if you look at the criticisms St. Photius made of the things they were doing, a lot of them they were criticisms based upon the apostolic canons. All right, it wasn't, for example, there's no evidence like some people try to say that St. Photius was criticizing like the canon of the Mass or something like that. All right, he was criticizing things like priests not having beards, saying the Filioque in the creed, not allowing priests to do chrismation. All right. Now, by the way, the chrismation, not allowing priests to do chrismation, that was something that was distinctive to only some areas of the Roman Rite. Like in Spain, priests always did chrismation.
Right.
Same thing in Ireland, the Gallican areas, in northern Italy. That was a very distinctive thing when the Roman Rite became prominent in Germany and they replaced the Gallican Rite. They basically were trying to impose the usages of the city of Rome upon a whole gigantic diocese, which didn't really work out. All right. But even then, they eventually allowed in many places priests to do chrismation. All right.
So that argument's not even valid.
And now, one other criticism that St. Photius made, which is correct criticism, was that these German priests were promoting xerophagy on Saturdays. Oftentimes it's translated Saturday fasting or Sabbath fasting, but what St. Photius was talking about is xerophagy. Xerophagy means not eating until after even Vespers is over, and then only eating bread and water.
Yep.
All right. Now, interestingly, in most of the West, they weren't doing that. What they were doing is that on a Saturday, they would, like on a Saturday in Lent, they would celebrate known, like at 9 o'clock. Actually, known Mass and Vespers would be ended by around noontime. That's what we call noontime noon, because they were associating with known and such.
Right.
And so they obviated the whole issue because it's like, in the Eastern Church, a lot of times people do pre-sanctified liturgies like early in like 9 o'clock in the morning, even though it ends with Vespers, Yeah. So point is that St. Photius saw these things and like, well, these are against the canons, and this is not right, and he complained a lot, and he had to break communion with Nicholas and condemn Nicholas over it. But when they held the 879 council, 880 council, and the interpolation of the Filioque was condemned, and communion was reestablished with the Western bishops, and especially with Rome, people said, what about all these other criticisms? And St. Photius' point was that, the criticisms, where they're doing things against the canons, they're still valid, but anything else that's not non-dogmatic or non-canonical issue, let them do what they're doing, because there's a famous reference where St. Photius was in a letter. If you look in the actual 1895 letter of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in reply, St. Photius talks about that those who do rites and customs that are in accord with the Catholic faith, but they're different than others, that there can be multiplicity of rites in the church as long as they don't contradict the dogmatic and canonical foundation of the church. All right. So, I don't see a problem with St. Photius' criticism.
Yeah, it was what did he say? It said in cases where the thing disregarded is not the faith, that is also the Holy Photius, and is not falling away from any general and Catholic decree, different rites and customs being observed among different people A man who knows how to judge rightly would decide that neither do those who observe them act wrongly, nor do those who have not received them break the law.
Yes. So, I mean, I think you could probably. So, I'm not sure what more to say about it, other than.
I'll be honest with you. I mean, that's been asked for by a few people, and frankly, I mean, I can cut and paste this entire section and just make it another video, because I think that those are the main points of contention.
Because remember, Saint Photius did go back into communion with everybody in the West after that council. Even now, there may have been a lot of harsh feelings with everybody. People kind of admit that there were, in fact, harsh letters back and forth, but they didn't break communion at that point. All right. Now, of course, there were also harsh feelings in the Byzantine Empire, because they were still partisans of Saint Ignatius, who didn't like Saint Photius.
Yeah.
Who arguably were the actual originators of a lot of this controversy, kind of latching on to other things and such. Now, interestingly, when Saint Methodius, who was consecrated a bishop, I believe, by Hadrian II, I can't remember, in the 860s, I believe. Remember, Saint Cyril Methodius were originally missionaries under Saint Photius, but then they made a trip to Rome when they brought the relics of Saint Clement, all right, which they discovered, Pope Saint Clement, and there's a famous mosaic in Rome about this, and there was a big deal when they received them, and I believe Saint Cyril, died in Rome. But Saint Methodius was consecrated an archbishop, Pannonia or something like that, by the Pope, and he was approved to do the Slavonic Mass. Now, it's interesting. Near the end of Saint Methodius' time, some of these same German missionaries from Bavaria that had caused some of these problems complained about things Saint Methodius was doing. Okay, and so there was actually a meeting was held in Rome, in which one of the things some of these missionaries said, the same ones who had caused problems in Bulgaria, was that Saint Methodius was not saying the Filioque in the Creed. Okay, and the Pope and the bishops at this meeting in Rome said, "Well, you're not supposed to be saying the Filioque in the Creed if you are saying it." All right. So, because remember, there was already the decision of 880, which had been acceded to, which locked the Creed. Okay. So at that point, it's anything that was being done by German missionaries or whoever saying the Filioque. Technically these were people of the clergy of the church, and who, if they were knowingly doing this and they knew about the council, they were doing this contrary to what the council had said.
Exactly.
All right.
So these ideas that in some way, shape, or form that there was some sort of Frankish conspiracy to take over the church and to rewrite it, and then of course, tied into the conspiracy is the false decretals, which apparently were used for a completely different reason when they were written, suddenly being repurposed to create this monarchical structure. It's
now interesting. The Ottonian emperors, the German Salian or the Ottonian emperors in the 10th century, who were not Franks, by the way, but they were German emperors from northern Saxony. But those emperors actually were the ones that, for example, had the most contact with Byzantium of all the Western emperors, all right, and were in the friendliest terms with Byzantium. For example, Luitprand of Cremona, who was a Lombard bishop of Cremona, Italy, was a representative of, I think, the Emperor Otto the First or maybe the Second, and he went to Constantinople, and he got in arguments with the emperor there, and he didn't like him personally, but they had no problem with Luitprand celebrating on Pentecost and Hagia Sophia. It wasn't like they were receiving Western people in the 10th century and be like, "We know you're a heretic, and we're not going to do anything with you." So now, interestingly, the Emperor Otto was also the one that held a council in Rome in 963 that deposed the infamous John XII from the papacy. So
I'm just curious because I'm looking up the whole Romanides thing, and I want to see what he says about Otto. Because it's interesting. He tends to, as I mentioned earlier, just kind of overgeneralize.
And I notice he doesn't provide a lot of heavily sourced, primary source documents.
No, he doesn't.
He just says stuff, all right? And it's like you're expected to accept whatever he says. And this is a problem with a lot of Romanidians. They quote Romanides as if he's a primary source document.
Let's see here, because I'm looking at Frank's Romans feudalism and doctrine, and so let's see here. Arnold lists among the monsters Pope John 12, who was put on trial in 1963 by Otto I and condemned in absentia. The report of Liutprand, the Lombard Bishop of Cremona, was that no proof was necessary at the trial. Let me see here.
Does he criticize the Is he going to defend John the 12th, or is he not?
No, what he says is that the Pope's alleged crimes were publicly known may be indicative of the need to re-examine such cases. Yes, he's actually saying that, Father. He's actually saying Pope John the 12th.
Yeah, okay. So John the 12th, who was notorious. I mean, if you look at all the contemporary records, he was like the worst of the pornocratic popes. Romanides is willing to defend him simply because
he does that with the Muslims too,
and the Lutherans, by the way.
But he says perhaps the most important incentive for replacing Roman popes with Franks and Lombards is revealed by the same Liutprand, a chief advisor to Otto I. He writes, "We, Lombards, Saxons, Franks, Lotharingians, Majorians, Swedes, Bulgarians have so much contempt, quote, for Romans and their emperor that when we become enraged with our enemies, we produce no other insult except Romani, Nisi Romani alone, i.e. the name of the Romans." I'm so curious as to what the ... is there. Hoc solo id est Romani nomine, meaning whatever.
He's quoting from what text of Liutprand of Cremona?
Let me take a look.
Because I have Liutprand Cremona's translated works in the next room. I can go look right now.
Yeah, it is number 35.
Let me go look it up. I'm gonna go get the book.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, so hold on one second. Okay, so Liutprand of Cremona's works. His works are the Retribution, the Homily concerning King Otto, and the Embassy of Liutprand. So which work is he quoting from?
It says here Relatio de Legatione Constantinopolitana. So
that's probably the embassy. That's probably the embassy. So okay, so what section of the embassy?
He puts in the Patrologia Latina. Give me 1 second. It says number 12.
Number 12. Okay. I mean, I don't doubt he may have said something like this.
But the problem is that what he meant by it.
Okay, so here, let me read it. Here's what he. Okay, now, so this is let's be frank. Liutprand had two embassies to the Emperor in Constantinople to represent King Otto, the Emperor Otto. Okay, the first embassy, everything he was really happy. The second embassy, he had a lot of arguments with them, okay, because he considered that they had promised that he believed the Roman emperor had promised certain things, and they basically lied to him, so he wasn't too happy. Okay, so let's take that into account. Okay, here's what Liutprand says. He says he did not permit it when I wanted to respond to this. That is the okay. Hold on a second here. There was before Section 12. There's an argument Liutprand is having with some Byzantine officials where they're insulting Germans and Lombards and things. Okay, maybe that was important to talk about.
That's kind of important for context if they're calling him names.
Yeah. Okay. So,
may as well just read the earlier.
Okay. Yeah. Hold on a second here. Let me get to it. Hold on. The problem is that they got to go back several pages because the argument's going several pages.
Wow.
Where, for example, the Emperor Romanus is insulting Otto. He's saying that they're no good, and let's see.
Anything you read, Father, at this point would be longer than the quote from Romanides.
Okay, so here's what happens. Okay, so on that day, before the nones of June, as we wrote above, we arrived at Constantinople before the Carian gate, and we waited with our horses until the 11th hour under rain that was not light. So he shows up at Constantinople, an official ambassador from Otto, and they keep him waiting in the rain. He's a bishop. Okay? At the 11th hour, Nicephorus, the emperor, did not consider us worthy to ride horses, and he ordered us to come in, and we were led to the aforementioned ugly, waterless, wide open marble house. So he was waiting in the rain. He was waiting in the rain. They took his horses away. He's a bishop, and they treated him with no respect. So he's not very happy to begin with. So this is often when people quote things from ancient sources, you have to know the context of it.
Yeah,
Okay?
well, I mean, it's kind of important because if you're saying if Romanides is basically arguing, and all these people who follow him are basically arguing that this was some sort of racial hatred, when it sounds like it was basically a bad Yelp review.
Okay, so on the 8th day before the Ides, the Saturday before Pentecost, I was led into the presence of the emperor's brother Leo, the chief of staff at the court and the minister, where we were exhausted by a great altercation over your imperial title. That is, he's writing this to the Emperor Otto. Okay, so he's not allowed to meet the emperor. The emperor's like, you're going to meet my brother first, so you're going to meet the prime minister. Okay, for he called you. That is, he called Emperor Otto not emperor. That is basilia in his tongue, but rather out of disdain, Riga, that is king in our tongue. Okay? When I answered this by saying that the meaning was the same, even if the signifier is different, he told me I had not come for the sake of peace, but to squabble. And thus, rising up in rage, he accepted your letter in a truly insulting way, through an interpreter and not into his own hands. And what a man was Leo, that the emperor's brother, fairly imposing, falsely humble, one who would pierce the hand of a man who leaned against him. So that in turn, the first meeting he had was basically an altercation over whether Otto can call himself emperor or not. Lupren says, well, king or emperor, it's kind of the same thing. The Byzantine emperor's brother is like, no, it's not, and I'm not going. And he walks out of the room, and he has one of his subordinates
accept. Large thuggish individual.
Yeah, and he has exactly, and then he has one of his subordinates accept an official letter from the Artonian emperor. Okay. Lupren then says, on the 7th day before the Ides, the holy day of Pentecost itself, I was led before Nikephoros, the emperor, in the residence called Stephana, or in the Latin, the Crown Palace. He, Nikephoros, is quite monstrous man, dwarfish, with a fat head and mole-like by virtue of the smallness of his eyes, deformed by a short beard that is wide and thick and graying, disgraced by a finger-licked neck, quite like Hyopus because of the abundance and thickness of his hair, in color quite like the Ethiopian who you would not like to. He quite looks like an Ethiopian whom you would not like to run into in the middle of the night, with an extended belly and a scrawny buttock, very long hips, measured. I'm not sure if this is just insulting. Okay, so
Lupren is really bad, is what it is.
Yeah. So he's okay. So he is insulting him. But let's be frank. Lupren shows up. He's kept in the rain. He's not. His horse is taken away. He's waiting for hours, and then he's led to meet the emperor's brother, where they get in a meeting argument. All right, and now exactly. And so the problem is that the rest of the pages are going to be an argument about this. Okay, so let me get some to the text. Okay, so there sat on the left, not aligned with him, but far behind, two small emperors, one his ruler, now subject to him. This was the beginning of their narrative. So I guess these are two minor rulers, or two Caesars, other Caesars under the emperor. Okay. They say, we should have indeed, we wish, we should have indeed,
Father,
we wish.
Father, I'll be right back.
Okay. We wish to welcome you kindly and magnificently, but the impiety of your Lord does not permit it. A man who arrogates Rome to himself with a hostile occupation, who took it by force from Berengar and Adalbert, that is the Lombard kings, against all law and custom, who killed some of the Romans by the sword, others by hanging, deprived others of their eyes, consigned still others to exile, and on top of that, attempted to subdue to his power the cities of our empire by murder and arson. And since his wicked scheme could not have the desired outcome, having fake peace, now he sends us you as a kataskopon, or spy, an instigator, an agent of his malice. To which Lupren replied, my lord did not invade the Roman city by force or in a tyrannical way, but rather he freed it from the yoke of the tyrant or tyrants. We're not effeminates lording it over Rome. That's a reference to basically the homosexual kind of effeminate sect that was kind of a pornocracy and all the rest that were kind of running the papacy at the time that Otto had to clean out. And what is more and sordid, we're not whores doing the same. Back then, I think your power was snoozing, along with that of your predecessors, who in the name alone and not in actual fact are considered emperors of the Romans. So Lupren's argument is that Otto comes in to Rome, he cleans out basically the effeminates, the prostitutes, all these other people kind of running the city, the kind of this effeminate homosexual gang, along with some of the Lombards. And his point is that, well, where were you when all this was happening? You know, why didn't you do anything? It took us to do this. So Lupren continues and he says, if they were are you there, Father Joseph?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so what I read is that the Byzantine officials, the Roman officials, say that Otto illegally invaded Rome. He forced out Berengar and Adalbert, and he killed a bunch of people, and he attacked us. And Lupran's reply is that, first off, Lupran says one of the reasons the Otto had to take control of the city of Rome was that he says the effeminates were running the papacy. What he means is that was kind of like the pornocracy. There's this homosexual group, and there's all kinds of bad stuff going on, okay? And Lupran says, well, where was the Byzantine emperor who ostensibly was supposed to be in charge of Rome when the papacy was doing all these evil and vile things? And that the German emperor had to come all the way from Saxony to take care of this, all right? So, okay, so Lupran then says, if they were powerful, if they, that is the Eastern Romans, Byzantines, were emperors of the Romans, why were they leaving Rome to the power of the whores? Were not some of the most holy popes expelled? Others so cast down they did not have enough to pay their daily expenses or for charity? Did not Adalbert send a libellous letter to Romanus and Constantine, your imperial predecessors? Did he not strip the churches of the most holy apostles with his robbery? Which of your emperors, led by zeal for God, bothered to avenge such an unworthy crime and return the holy church to its proper condition? You neglected to, but my Lord did not neglect it. He who, arising from the ends of the earth and coming to Rome, cast out the impious ones, that's John the 12th and the other wicked pope, and returned every right and privilege to the vicars of the holy apostles. Afterwards, following the decrees of the Roman emperors Justinian, Valentinian, Theodosius, and others, he felled, throttled, hanged, and relegated to exile those who rebelled against him in the those who rebelled against him and the apostolic Lord. People who were violators of oaths, sacrilegious, torturers of their apostolic lords, were robbers. If he had not done these things, then he, Otto, then would have been impious, unjust, cruel, and tyrant. It is manifest that Berengar and Adalbert, having become Otto's soldiers, took the golden scepter of the Italian kingdom from his hands, and in the presence of your servants who are alive to this day and live in the city, promised loyalty by swearing an oath. And since, with the devil instigating, they perfidiously violated it, he rightly deprived them of the kingdom as deserters and rebels against him, which you would do too to any subjects who afterwards became rebels. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second. One of the reasons the Byzantines were apparently the question. So Lupran's argument is, why wasn't the Roman emperor in Constantinople doing anything when the papacy was being controlled by whores, effeminate prostitutes, and all these terrible people? That it took a German emperor from 1,000 miles away to come down and do something, or 2,000 miles away. Another point is the Byzantines during this period had an infamous patriarch named Theophilus Lycopanos, a few years before this happened, and he was just as worse as John the 12th. All right, so anyway. But, said the Byzantine official, a soldier of Adalbert does not acknowledge this version. To which I answer, if he contradicts it, one of my soldiers will demonstrate that it is so in a duel tomorrow if you order it. So that's a trial by combat. That sounds unusual, but that was done. It may be so the Byzantine official then admits it. He says, it may be that he did these things as you say. Now explain why the boundaries of our empire are attacked by war and fire. We are friends and thought of making an indissoluble alliance by marriage. So this is what Lupran is talking about. And the Bulgarians have the same problems with the Byzantine Romans. I mean, this is all the people who were, Slavic people have the same problems. It turns out at the very beginning they're attacking the Otto and the Ottonians as being murderers and doing terrible things, okay? But then after Lupran gives a big reply and he rebuts all these accusations, then one of the Byzantine Caesars says, well, we're friends. Why are you saying bad things against us? All right? And the Bulgarians who, were Eastern Rite and all the rest, this was not an Eastern Rite, Western Rite thing. This was something people had when they dealt with the Byzantines, because one of the way the Byzantine Romans maintained authority was to be frank, they could, instigate rebellions and, kind of psychological warfare. Okay. Because, I'm not faulting them for that, but, that's one of the things they did. The land, Lupran says, which you relate as being part of your empire, the indigenous people and the language show to be part of the Italian kingdom. The Lombards held it by might, and Louis, the emperor of the Lombards and Franks, freed it from the hands of the prostrated Saracen hordes. So in other words, the Muslims invaded parts of Italy, conquered it from the Lombards. Okay, Otto, the Ottonians didn't reconquer it, and then the Byzantines complained that, well, this land, Italy was once controlled by Constantinople 300 years ago. Okay, So do you see how we're getting to these petty arguments about all this stuff, Father Joseph?
But these petty arguments are important. And the reason why they're important is because when you read something like Romanides, not knowing the history...
did he know? Did he read this book, or did he just extract a section from it?
This is what he wrote after he took Liutprand's quote. He said, perhaps the real reason that John XII became the monster of Frankish propaganda was that he dared, note the perhaps, was that he dared restore the older tradition of dating papal documents by the years of the reign of the Roman Emperor in Constantinople. In any case, Liutprand's tirade against the Romans, just quoted, reveals the fact that he knew very well that East and West Romans were one nation, and that the emperor in Constantinople was the real emperor of the Romans. This tirade also reveals the fact that Liutprand was not aware of the prevailing theory among modern European historians that the Germanic nations became one nation with the Romans in Western Europe. As is clear from Liutprand, the Germanic peoples of his time would have been insulted by such claims. How does that sound like anything that you just read?
No, and there's more. It goes on. For example, okay, so Liutprand then says, Landulf, Prince of Beneventans and Capuans, subjugated it by force to himself for 7 years, nor would it have escaped the yoke of subjection to him and successors up to the present day, if the Emperor Romanus had not brought the friendship of our King Hugh by handing over a vast sum, and this was the reason why he united in marriage his nephew and namesake to the illegitimate daughter of our King Hugh. Okay, so that's interesting. So King Hugh, I think, may have been a Lombard king, I guess, he had one of his relatives marry Emperor Romanus, visit Emperor's relatives married him. Okay, so, and as I see it, you ascribe to my lord not kindness, but powerlessness, because after acquiring Italy and Rome, he left them to you for so many years. So after Otto sets everything in order in Rome, after getting rid of Octavian the monster, he leaves Rome, and he's like, okay, I guess the Byzantines can have it back, okay? But guess what? The Byzantines simply neglect most of it. They don't really they're not interested in that in doing anything. All right? Now, my point is that you're dealing with a lot of complicated stuff here. But so it's not just simply one side or the other. But let's get to the section. I'm going to skip over some stuff, but let's get to the section. I mean, I'm skipping over a lot of 3 pages of going back and forth where they're arguing with each other. Yeah. And here's what happens. Okay, so when I would answer appropriately and truthfully to the accusations that you're lying, he said, the soldiers of your lord are ignorant of horse riding and do not know about infantry combat. So that's where the emperor Nicephorus is attacking Liutprand the bishop for. So now it's getting to the point where he's attacking the soldiers of the Ortonians. Wow. He said, soldiers of your lord are ignorant of horse riding and do not know about infantry combat. The size of shields, the weight of breastplates, the length of swords, and the heft of helmets does not allow them to fight in either way. Then chuckling, then laughing, he said, also their gullets, voracity prevents them. That is, the gluttony of their stomachs, their gut is their god. Their courage is debauchery, their steadfastness is drunkenness. Going without rations is their undoing, and fear is their sobriety. Nor is there a large number of fleets afloat on the sea serving your lord. So you don't have a good army in your navy. Your navy is stupid.
This is really.
So it's getting to the point. To me alone, this is what the emperor says. To me alone belongs the steadfastness of sailors. To me, who will attack him, that is Otto, with fleets and demolish his maritime cities in war, and reduce to ashes those that are close to rivers. Who, I ask, can resist me even on land with scanty forces? Otto's son was not absent. His wife was not missing. The Saxons, Swabians, Bavarians, and Italians were all with him. Yet when they both did not know how and were not able to take one tiny city that resisted them, how would they resist me when I arrive, followed by armies numerous? As are the crops of Gargarus, as are the great bunches on Methymna, as are the stars in the sky, as are the waves in the sea. So does that sounds like it goes from an arguing about certain things to now the visiting emperor is like, I'm going to attack all your cities, destroy their populations. I mean, that you see what he say? He basically insulting. Okay, so yeah. That's the context leading up to the infamous quote Romanides talks about. Yeah. Okay, so here's section 12. He, that is the Emperor Nicephorus, did not permit it when I wanted to respond to this and throw out a counter argument worthy of his inflation. Instead, Nicephorus, as if to insult us, said. So Nicephorus says, "You are not Romans, but Lombards." Though he wanted to say something beyond this and waved his hand so that I would be quiet, I spoke out, being upset, and I said this. The annals recognize that fratricidal Romulus, from whose name they are called Romans, was born to a whore. That is, he was generated in defilement, and he made a refuge for himself where he welcomed defaulted debtors from foreign climes, runaway slaves, murderers, and people who deserved death for their crimes. And he attracted such a throng of such people that he called them Romans. From this aristocracy there arose those whom you call cosmocrators or emperors. That means the Lombards, Saxons, Franks, Lotharingians, Bavarians, Swabians, Burgundians, so disdained them that we uttered no other insult than you Roman to our enemies when aroused. And we understand that single term, the name of the Romans, to include every baseness, every cowardice, every kind of greed, every promiscuity, every mendacity, indeed every vice. Since you say we are unwarlike and ignorant of writing skills, if the sins of the Christians merit that you persist in this harshness, the coming wars will demonstrate what type of men you are and how pugnacious we are. So yeah, he did say we insult people while saying they're Romans.
Yeah, well, but he was basically, I mean, he was.
Well, there's more. The Emperor Nicephorus gave a bunch more insults I didn't read too. But so my point is that there's no context in that. Romanides is treating it like Lupran came there and said, "We hate you guys and you stupid Romans."
That's all he actually say he came there.
Well, this is a conversation. My point is that there was a context to what was actually being discussed. That's all my point.
Yeah, but it's central because this is something that he uses in multiple.
Well, it gets worse because they had to have dinner that later night. Because he's got it. Because now this is like the first day. All right. So, but he's got to stay there and have dinner with him, with the emperor. Okay. Okay. So here's I mean, here's what happens. It says, Nicephorus, angered by such words, called for silence with his hand, and ordered the long, narrow table removed, and myself returned to the hated house, if I were to speak more truthfully, prison. Then after 2 days I was afflicted by such a deep prostration, first through my indignation, and then the heat and thirst, that there was no one among my retainers who did not fear his last day approach after having drunk from my same cup. Why, I asked, did they, too, not fall ill, whose drink was brine in lieu of fine wine, whose bedding in lieu of hay straw, or even earth was hard marble, who had stone in lieu of pillow, whose wide open house did not protect from heat, rain, or cold. So they didn't give them very good accommodations, was the other part. Even health itself poured over them, could not save them if it wanted to. Therefore, debilitated by mine own suffering, as well as that of my men, having summoned the guardian, or rather my persecutor, I arranged, not just by pleas, but by paying a price, that he would deliver to the brother of Nicephorus my letter, saying things like this, quote, this is the letter Lupran wrote to Leo, the emperor's brother. He said, Bishop Lupran to Leo, chief of staff, and minister to Dromo. The sufferings which I am undergoing here will not wear me out if the most serene emperor is thinking of granting the request on account of which I came. Only that through a letter from me and messengers, my Lord Otto should be told that I am not delaying the matter here. But if the emperor considers the matter differently, there is here a freight ship of the Venetians which hastens to depart. Let him permit me, sick as I am, to board it, so that if the time of my collapse were to arrive, at least my corpse may be welcomed by the land of my birth. When he read this, he ordered me to come to him after 4 days. There sat with him to debate your matter men very learned according to their tradition, strong with their Greek language. So anyway, Lupran's like, I'm sick, I'm going to die. He writes a letter to the chief of staff and says, look, if you're not going to be serious about this, there's a Venetian ship, I'm just going to go home. All right? To me, this seems like it could be. This is like a negotiating technique between the Byzantines and the Artonians.
Yeah.
All right. That everybody's being as harsh as possible as they can to each other. Okay. So Basil, the head of the imperial bedchamber, the first secretary, the chief of the imperial wardrobe, and 2 teachers. This was the beginning of their narration. So this is the Byzantine presentation. They say, "Explain, brother Bishop Lupran, what the cause might be that you wore yourself out to announce." When I spelled out to them the recompense of kinship, which would be the opportunity for endless peace, they said, it is unheard of for the porphogenita, or of a porphogenitus, that is a purple born of a purple born, that is a royal of a royal, that is the daughter born in purple to one who was himself born in purple, to be mixed up with the peoples. All right? Now the peoples here is a reference to, they mean the barbarians.
Right.
Okay?
The conquered people.
Exactly. So the Byzantine Romans basically regarded all the kind of Lombards, all these other people as basically beneath them. Okay. Yes. I mean, even it didn't matter if Otto was an emperor or king. He was like king of the peasants, almost is how they would think of it. Okay. Truly, since frankly, the Byzantines thought of the same thing of the Bulgarians and the Serbs in the same way. Okay. Truly, since you seek such a rarefied thing, you will receive what pleases you only if you give what is appropriate. That is, Ravenna and Rome, with all the lands uninterrupted which extend from there to us here. If you in fact desire friendship without kinship, let your Lord allow Rome to be free, and also let him hand over into their original slavery the Capuan and Beneventan princes, formerly slaves of our holy empire, and now rebels against it. So they say that we're willing to talk if you give over Rome, Ravenna. Basically, you just hand over Italy to us. Then we'll talk about marriage negotiations.
And you take out all those people who.
And you give us back all those slaves. And you give us back exactly. Okay. To them, Lupran replied, even you are not unaware that my lord, the Emperor Otto, has mightier Slavic peoples under him than the king of the Bulgarians, Peter, who led off in marriage the daughter of the Emperor Christopher. But Christopher, they said, was not born in the purple. So the emperor, there was a previous, I think, a Byzantine Roman Emperor Christopher, who was basically a soldier that became emperor, is what they're talking about. Right. Okay. In truth, I said, whom does Rome serve that you clamor for it to wish to be free? To whom does she pay tribute? Was she not serving whores before? And with you snoozing and certainly not showing any valor, did not my master, the august emperor, free her from so base a form of servitude? As Otto was Cosmocrator, the august emperor Constantine, as he was Cosmocrator, the august emperor Constantine, who built this city in his own name, contributed many gifts to the Holy Apostolic Roman Church, and not just gifts in Italy, but in almost all the Western kingdoms, and in the eastern and southern ones too, namely in Greece, Judea, Persia, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Egypt, and Libya, as testify his charters that are in our possessions. Rightly, my lord Otto handed over to the vicar of the Most Holy Apostles whatever belonged to the Church of the Most Holy Apostles in Italy, Saxony, Bavaria, and all the kingdoms of my lord. That's reference to properties that the Roman See had owned in these lands. If it happened that my lord kept back anything from all of these, whether cities, men, or soldiers, or a single family, then I have denied God. Why does not your emperor do the same thing, so that he returns to the Church of the Apostles its properties that are in his realms, and thus render richer and freer that church which, through toil and generosity of my lord, is necessary, rich, and free? So what here Luprand is saying is that the common argument the Roman popes, whether they were pro-Byzantine or pro-Ortonian, have been saying for some time. Why doesn't the Byzantine emperor return back over the properties in Sicily, the diocesan properties in Sicily, southern Italy, Dalmatia, Greece, and Macedonia that were originally part of the Roman Patriarchate? Okay? But he will do that, said Basil, the head of the imperial bedchamber, when he makes Rome and the Roman Church obedient to his nod. Then I said, a certain fellow, having suffered much harm from another, approaches God with these words, Lord, avenge me of mine enemy. God answered him, I will do it, he said, on the day when I will give to each according to his deeds. But the fellow replied, how late? Then all except the emperor's brother left the disputation, shaking with laughter, and ordered me to be led back to the hated house, and to be guarded with great care into the feast day of the Holy Apostles, celebrated by all the clerics. So it seems like they weren't they were like, they were just laughing in his face most of the time. Yeah. On that feast day, it says, on the feast day of the Holy Apostles, I was quite sick, but nevertheless he ordered me and the messengers of the Bulgarians, who arrived the day before, to meet him at the Church of the Holy Apostles. When, after the wordiness of the chants and the celebration of the Mass, we were invited to table, he placed the messenger of the Bulgarians, shorn in the Hungarian style, girt with a bronze chain, and as my mind suggested to me, not yet baptized, at the furthest end of the table, which was long and narrow, but closer than me to himself, obviously as an insult to you, my august lords. For you I underwent. So in other words, they have to deal with Luprand because Otto, even though they don't like Otto and they consider him like a peasant ruler almost, he's still a force to be reckoned with. Okay? So they have to still deal with him. For you I underwent contempt, for you I was disdained. As I sought to leave, indignant, Leo, the chief of staff and the brother of the emperor, and the first secretary, Simon, followed behind me, howling. When Peter, the emperor of the Bulgarians, led off Christopher's daughter as spouse, symphonies, that is, accords, were written and sealed with oaths, so that we should give precedence to give honor and favor to the Bulgarians' apostles. That is, the messenger above the apostles of all the other nations. The apostle of the Bulgarians, though he is, as you say, and is true, shorn, unwashed, and girt with a bronze chain, nevertheless is a noble, and we judge it unpropitious to give precedence over him to a bishop, especially one of the Franks. And since we perceive you bear this without dignity, we will not allow you to return to your hostel, not as you think, but will force you to savor the food with the slaves of the emperor in a certain cheap inn. To them I answered nothing, because of a boundless pain within my heart. But I did what they had ordered, considering dishonorable a table where my precedence is given to a Bulgarian messenger over not me, that is Bishop Lupran, but over one of your messengers. For the holy emperor alleviated my pain with a great gift, sending me from his most refined foods a fat goat, one of which he himself had eaten, totally overloaded with garlic, onions, leeks, drowned in fish sauce, which I wish could appear on your own table, my lords, so that whatever delectables you did not believe fitting for your holy emperor, at least having seen, you might believe it. When 8 days had passed, once the Bulgarians had gone, thinking I would esteem his table highly, he invited me, still quite sick, to eat with him in the same table. The patriarch was there, so he's having dinner with the emperor again, 8 days later, and the patriarch was there, along with many bishops, in whose presence he proposed to me many issues concerning the Holy Scriptures, which I elegantly explained with the Holy Spirit inspiring me. And suddenly, now remember, Lupran could speak Greek, so he's not using a translator, okay? And suddenly, so as to make a joke of you, he, the emperor, asked what councils we accept. When I answered the Nicene, Chalcedonian, Ephesine, Antiochian, Carthaginian, and Carian Constantinopolitan, he said, "Ha, ha, ha, you forget to say the Saxon one. If you ask why that one is not in our books, I answer because it's primitive, and it could not yet make it through to us." I'm not sure what he's talking about. They're just making jokes about the Saxons now at this point. All right, the Byzantines. I'm not really going to read the rest, Father Joseph, because it goes on and on. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. But if you see that Romanides isn't simply just taking one quote about Lupran and then ignoring the fact that he was in the midst of an argument doesn't do justice to anything.
Yeah, no, I admit it. And I not only do I admit that, I mean, if you look at Romanides' text compared to the actual history, you'll realize it does not hold up to scrutiny. It simply, it just doesn't. Basically, he treats Otto III as kind of like a secret Frank when his mother was a Byzantine princess. It's just, there's so much factually wrong that all I can say is the Frankish Thesis is honestly nothing more than really interesting sounding conspiracy theory.
Not very good conspiracy.
Not good. They're colorful, but false. CSS, have either of you hosts read Guinan? If so, love some discussion on this thought.
Who is this guy?
Rene Guinan was some philosopher who was a theosophist, and he was into all sorts of funky stuff, and he was a Mason. Like I mean, no offense, I can barely read his wiki article. I wouldn't take anything somebody of that sort has to say, because I don't believe that truth is outside the church. I believe that truth, even scientific truth, is harmonic with the church. So if I see somebody whose entire worldview is colored by something that is against the church, then I wouldn't do it. I have no interest in it. I know people who are into that sort of stuff, but I think it's not productive. Hopefully they come to Christ. Atomic Lead was like, I was on board with that until the fish sauce. I pointed out that the fish sauce, and I would love to do a recipe on, pre-medieval and pre-schism, foods.
That was a dish that the Emperor Nicephorus had made for Lupran as like a consolation prize because he had been so mean to him.
Well, that's actually a classic Roman dish. The fermented fish sauce goes back to even, I think, like 200 BC. So they had perfected it by then. And I really want to try some.
Well, remember, the Emperor Constantine brought over all these cooks and officials over from Rome, so they would have just continued in Constantinople.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of modification and change, and it's worth. As I said, I want to do an episode on it just because. Just even reading recently about
we're going to do an apologetics episode on fish sauce.
No, not on fish sauce. On food of the pre-schism West. Did you know that they actually used almond milk to make fake eggs?
Well, why not just simply? I mean, we can expand it to kind of a program on fasting foods and basically how the church has handled foods.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, the way it's handled it 1,000 years ago isn't really all that different from the way it handles it now. We tend to think it was like that, I mean, it's funny because, you know, we tend to think in terms of like people were bigger fasters than we are today. But in many cases,
things were much more restrained because, for example, you couldn't refrigerate things. So it wasn't like, you could preserve non-fasting foods. You had to eat things on that day. So there was, because of the lack of modern technology, they may have been a greater impetus that you had a somewhat of a greater safeguard maybe from violating fasting rules. Like you weren't tempted to go into the refrigerator because there was no refrigerator. All right.
Yeah. But what I mean by that is that like the fasting customs of people, the same tendencies to, they would take like fish steaks and they would dress them up so that they look like real steaks and things like that. It was pretty funny reading it. I'm thinking to myself, food substitution's been going around forever. I mean, we know that with falafel, it was basically a veggie burger. But in any case, Sean Ridlin writes, I think Father Seraphim Rose was interested in him. I think this is going to be our last comment. Father Seraphim, who I consider saintly, he was far more read than I am. And more importantly, I still wouldn't read occult writings. I think Father Seraphim was originally... He was in that before he became a Christian, wasn't he?
He was into all kinds of Tibetan, Eastern mysticism before he became Orthodox.
Same old. That's what it comes down to. And so,
who was Rene Guénon? He was like some kind of Western esotericist or something like that.
He was, he was a Western esotericist. I mean, like literally,
was he like a Julian Evola guy or what? I'm not exactly.
I'll just, as a young student in Paris, Guénon observed and became involved with some students who
was he the founder of what was called traditionalism?
Yeah, traditionalist, I guess you could say, the traditionalist school of philosophy. That's interesting.
Basically said there was supposedly there was truth in all different traditions or something like that.
Yeah, but his biography.
Was he also Muslim? Was he like a Sufi Muslim or something too?
He was everything. Went on soon discovered the esoteric Christian Martinist order, supervised by Pappus, was a regular. He joined the Gnostic Church, founded by Faber des Arts Sidesius, under the name Tau Polygenius. Polygenius went on, became the founder and main contributor of a periodical review, Gnosis, writing for 1922. From his incursions into French occultists and pseudo-Masonic orders, he despaired of the possibility of ever gathering these diverse and often ill-assorted doctrines into a, quote, stable edifice. Skip further to him joining the Scottish Rite. He became acquainted with Hinduism, Taoism. He learned to use opium. That's no surprise. He used it for...
It looks like a guy who was terribly demonically deceived. He was looking for truth, but he can never find it because of this deception.
Then he went...
He's doing all these terrible things. And
then once he became a Muslim, he said he believed Islam is the only traditional religious world that is practically accessible to Westerners. Oh, boy. And so he became a Sufi Muslim... And then he started doing a study of Hindu doctrines. He died with his final word being Allah. Yeah, no, he has nothing. I don't know what his... okay, I don't know if I'd go with abandoned Catholicism for Sufism Atomic Lead. I mean, this guy was... I'm
not sure if he was ever even technically really Roman Catholic, was he?
Yeah, I don't know. This is just some weird theosophist guy, and so yeah, that's no. It has no interest to me. And I'm sorry that I feel bad because I guess as a founder of the traditionalist school, although I don't know how you can be a traditionalist surrounding yourself with nothing but the occult.
What do they mean by traditionalism, though?
The traditionalist school is a group of 20th and 21st century thinkers concerned with what they consider to be the demise of traditional forms of knowledge, both aesthetic and spiritual, within Western society. A belief of this school is the existence of a perennial wisdom or perennial philosophy, which says
perennialism.
Primordial and universal truths, which form the source for and are shared by all the major world religions.
Okay, so that's basically Masonry. Masonry.
Yeah.
I mean,
Masonry, ecumenism. He's like everything that we don't want to be.
He's everything we're against.
Well, CS is like, to be fair, you guys know nothing about him. Well, I assume the people who wrote the wiki did. And
I mean, if he's teaching that Islam is good and Hinduism is good and all this other stuff, that's not acceptable.
We don't have to be a scholar on his writings to know he's wrong. It's I don't have to know the doctrines of flat earthers to assume that they're wrong. I don't have to, if someone.
I mean, I'm not an expert in Jainism. but I reject it.
Yeah, and I mean, Anton LaVey, I barely read any of his works, but I'm pretty sure that I reject them.
I mean, I've only read. I mean, I remember when I was younger, when I was like 12 or 10, I got a book from the used bookstore called "The Mystic Rites to Freemason" by C.W. Leadbeater.
Yeah, I think they actually saw that in Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, and it was like he was like the theosophist and such like that, and I mean, I'm familiar with some of this stuff, and I read some of this stuff when I was younger. But once you start reading the Holy Scriptures and then the Fathers of the Church, you just, I got rid of all that.
Well, I
don't want to go back to any of it.
Yeah, the thing that gets me is that you're right, C.S. that he renounced theosophy and converted to Islam and lived a very quiet life in Egypt. Yeah, but according to what I just read, that was on the basis that it would be the only religious background from which a Westerner could be really fully.
It seems he's conceived. It seems that he has. It seems that he has a conception that all religions have truth, and it's a practical issue of what religion you choose to best help, I guess, the West or best help. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a real search for sacrificial truth, but what actually is the truth, and you got to stick with that.
Yeah, and I mean, if this is the underpinning of what this traditionalist movement is about, the whole, God of nature or nature thing, man, that's not even Christian. Yeah, Guinan-going Muslim and Rose-going Orthodox are two sides of the same coin. They both came to the same conclusion from their explorations in metaphysics. I would suggest reading the life of Father Sherrill from Rose. A lot of it came from his experience. But that's I would disagree with that. So in any case, I would say that you can just throw in any two. You can throw in any two converts to any religion and say they're two sides of the same coin, but that's not truth. Ledbetter was a pedophile too, if I remember correctly. That's depressing. But
yeah, all those people, not just Ledbetter. Who was the other guy that was associated with him?
Well,
the other theosophist.
The other occult schools.
Yeah.
That's always what happens. According to Christian Word. Okay, so you have like really a factual basis there. Well, it's depressing. The point I'm trying to make is, and this is one of the things that is difficult, and I think I say this in general when people talk about Orthodoxy, in general, they have a problem with saying this, is that the church is the pillar and ground of truth. There's no way around that. Ultimately, a lot of the stuff you might have read may have indirectly led you here, but ultimately that was the Holy Spirit moving through it and moving through you. In the end, all this stuff is, all this other stuff outside the church is meaningless. Well, you can make that argument too, but that's not what the wiki article says. I don't care enough about him to really find out.
All right, do we really need to continue talking about some weird French theosophist?
Yeah, I mean, it's silly. The whole thing is ridiculous. But the point is, once again, I don't care really what occult speakers talk about. I don't know. It depends. Do you mean truth or my truth? That's the thing. A lot of people
because only Jesus Christ is truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life. Pontius Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And that was what was so ironic about that is truth himself was standing before him. All right. So once you have Christ as a truth, why seek these other things?
We might sound like Bible thumpers if we keep this up, Father.
Well, there's nothing. I mean, I can tell you can read St. John Chrysostom. He would have told you the exact same thing.
Exactly. And that's what it comes down to. All the saints, all the fathers.
I mean, unless you want to study these things to be a heresiologist, just to study heresy to rebut it or something like that. I mean, I can't imagine people bringing up these heresies, and you have to somehow understand a little bit of it to rebut it. I mean, that does make some sense.
Yeah, but when I read a little bit and it's that ridiculous, I dismiss it.
Well, they're these things are all recycled heresies.
Yeah,
so.
And so
nothing new under the sun, as King Solomon said.
No, the advice of the fathers was take what's good from the pagans in terms of their learning and leave the rest. We already know what's good because the fathers have already done that. What new guys come up with, and they recycle old heresies that we've already rejected.
And they were talking about like Plato, who lived hundreds of years before.
Yeah, they were talking about actual philosophers.
They weren't talking about some 19th century guy who rejected, who had 1900 years after the birth of Christ, and then came to the conclusion that he wanted to reject Christianity. So.
Now, Pravoslavy Max Boy 50 says, this is unrelated to the topic, but what do you think of Archbishop Macarius of Greece? Well, I think he's got one more bishop. I
I think they have a number of bishops over there, don't they?
They just took in that last Hockna bishop, and now they're.
Oh yeah, Bishop.
Gary,
The other Bishop Macarius of Toronto. Did they actually take him in, or is he still appointed?
I think they're going to take him in. They're probably going to refer to him as Bishop Macarius the Less or something.
Okay.
But in any case, all right. Well, in any case, we've gone way over time. I was actually really tired, so I was going to see if we could do this for an hour, but we did 2 in 10 minutes.
Well, maybe we should later take the program and break it up from the Ecumenical Council section to the Frankish Thesis section, which we talked about.
Not a bad idea. We might do that. We'll probably do that actually. So thanks to everyone, even people who have weird opinions, which we will answer, even if the answers are.
So Pravoslavi says he's part of Bishop Macarius of Toronto's church, and they have taken him in it.
Oh well, congratulations to him.
Well, he got out of Hockna.
Yeah, and Hockna is now officially just a name worshiping.
So he because Bishop Macarius was the last of the original bishops from the 1990s, I think, right?
Correct.
So I mean, once Benjamin Ephraim died, so now it's just basically Imaslavas guys who took it over. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks to everyone. Even when we disagree, Christ is risen. Last week we can say that.
He is risen.
Ascension coming. And
yes, Ascension. Yep.
Yeah, that's this Thursday.
Yep.
And so have a great night, and we'll probably break up the show into 2 tomorrow.
All right.
Benedicite.
Benedicite.